In the beginning, there was Caine. Supposedly, probably, maybe, who knows? Look, the first thing you need to understand is that the history of Vampire the Masquerade is built on a foundation of wet sand. And the sand is made of lies, and it's wet with the blood of all those who believed them. It's not just contradictions created by lore retcons from edition to edition that become a problem. It's contradictions they put in deliberately to reflect the various different opinions and perspectives of the vampire world. The elaborate deceptions and propaganda efforts woven by the elders. And frankly, just the lack of solid evidence interpreted by a handful of eccentric kindred archaeologists and historians. They didn't have no Karl Popper and no Foucault in the vampire world. There was no positivism debate in the Camarilla, and there sure wasn't one in the Sabbat. Most of the things that would count as history books about vampires in the world of darkness are secret. And given that vampires have always tried to remain somewhat hidden in the history of the Caine, the mortals, you're never going to find any clear-cut evidence for them there. And the Caine don't even believe in vampires. It's a very successful campaign. They could, and they do, describe vampires in ancient history, but they do so thinking they're talking about deities and metaphors. Many official materials have been published diving deep into these secrets, and most of them offer a range of possible answers to the questions those campaigns pose, and encourage folks to come up with their own interesting solutions as well. There's also my own perspective on the whole thing, the opinions I have formed as a little bit of an expert, not just familiar with vampire, but most of the World of Darkness game lines. Not to mention my cultural biases from living as just a silly little guy in a silly little world. So while I have done my best trudging through dozens of source books and wikis and online posts to recollect the key points on the timeline for you, despite this video's length, most things I will not be able to cover, you have to think of this as mythology that slowly transitions into highly propagandized and edited history. You have to be aware that none of what I tell you may be truly what happened. And the farther back we go, the truer that untruth is. Starting with Caine. According to the best-selling book known as the Beauclair, Caine was the first guy who murdered someone, that someone being his brother Abel, of whom he was jealous. He then lied to God about it and got indignant when God called him out. So God went, you know what, you little shit, I'm just gonna curse you for eternity. There wasn't that many people back then, he could afford to micromanage a little bit. But of course, that's only one story. The most commonly retold one is that God demanded sacrifices, and while Caine offered the products of harvest and forage, Abel offered his most prized cattle. Caine saw this, thought, you can do that? And decided to sacrifice Abel to God, because that follows. Surely, man would be the most prized of cattle. This may have been because he was jealous at Abel's superior sacrifice, or because God favored Abel, or because Caine loved God so much he wanted to sacrifice the thing he loved most, his own brother, or maybe because he hated Abel and was looking for some sort of excuse to murder him. As punishment, he was exiled by Adam, marked an outcast, and forced to wander the land of Nod, which is understood by most to be not so much a place, but like an itinerant state, a ceaseless wander. Another version of the story says that God rewarded Caine by making him king of the night, so that he may terrify the flock of mortals and thereby make them more righteous and obedient to the will of their creator. Adam then exiled him out of jealousy. In Nod, he met Lilith, his dad's ex-wife, which is true, by the way. That shit is part of, like, biblical lore, but they leave it out of Sunday school stories. God had a wife too, but we call her the Holy Spirit these days. Lilith was Adam's first wife, created as his equal, but she was unruly and had desires and a personality of her own, which is why God created Eve from Adam's rib to be an obedient and somewhat stupid wife. In fact, so obedient and stupid that she ate the apple the snake offered, which she was then blamed for, even though she had been created to do that. This is what they made her like. See, this is what happens when you deprive women of education and deny them reasoning skills. You get cast out of paradise. Patriarchy is the original sin. And Lilith saw this young man and thought, He has the aura of someone who killed a human, but that's not possible, as humans cannot kill humans. Only God can kill a human. This must mean this young man is somehow God or God-related. So she took him in, and of course they ended up fucking. Lilith, being equal to Adam, had magical powers as Caine's father did, but quite different ones, and indeed ones that seemed to Caine much more powerful than those of his crusty patriarch. He learned from her in a ritual where she fed him her blood and put him into a world-shattering trance that involved total ego death and just like spirals and rainbows. And in that trance, he was visited by 4 guys who were angels, all of whom offered him the opportunity to repent for the sin of having murdered his brother and reject the illumination he was experiencing. Caine decided not to do that. So the guy named Michael cursed him and his blood never to walk in the sun. The guy named Raphael cursed him and his blood to be hurt by the sun. And the guy named Uriel cursed him and his blood to become dependent on the blood of man to remain alive, and thus be shunned by all the world forever as a monster. The 4th guy, Gabriel, went, look man, the other guys, they're really fucking mad, dude. And you messed up, man, you really did. But bruv, I don't want to be as much of a meanie, you know what I'm saying? And frankly, I can't come up with another curse. All of these seem pretty sun-themed, well, except for Uriel's, but he's always a bit special. And I feel like we've sort of exhausted that as a theme. But then I can't copy Uriel, you know, he doesn't respond well to it. And then I also don't want to open like a whole new can of beans at the end of this story. So I'm just going to tell you that there is a path of redemption for you and all who follow you as well. You just got to find it and, you know, become so holier than even the most holiest of humans. And then Caine awakened and over a period of time developed immense magical powers in his own right. These magical powers would later become known as the disciplines, the original powers of the vampiric clans. He didn't make all of them. Many disciplines, of course, were developed by other vampires later down the line, but the main ones, animalism, auspex, celerity, dominate, fortitude, obfuscate, potence, presence, and protean, that's Caine. Eventually he realized that Lilith was limiting his potential, controlling him, trying to keep him a slave for herself, whether out of loneliness or malice. So he used his powers to break free of her bond and went back to wandering. Now, a couple things. We know for a very factual fact that a lot of this is very metaphorical. It is canon in the world of darkness that the world is incredibly ancient, and like before this, or maybe during this, the werewolves were doing their whole tyranny bit. So the biblical story doesn't fit a biblical time frame exactly, and Cain and Abel were not among the first humans, definitely, and Cain definitely was not the first murderer. There are several ways of viewing this, one of which is the mage perspective. In this story, the biblical characters are not just humans, but mages, awakened masters of reality, or certainly Adam and Lilith were, and Cain and Abel were apprentices to Adam. Maybe Abel actually awakened before Cain, and Cain murdered him for it. Probably there were other apprentices, and presumably other transgressions. Because the curses that came from the angels were pretty hefty. Let's be... like, there was a lot of curse for, like, murder is bad, but that was a lot. Demons claim that Abel's death actually caused the first great maelstrom in the underworld, or alternately spawned the maelstrom as a phenomenon into existence, depending on your reading of it. According to Stygian records, of course, the first great maelstrom was caused by the fall of Rome, which was like a little bit after this. Lilith effectuated this awakening, so I'm thinking that maybe she was the problem, being like a jilted rival of Adam. Cain may not even have met her by accident, but went to search for her in order to attain the awakening that Adam would not grant him. So that's why Adam cursed him again via the angels. They're kind of mysterious, you know, angels are part of the world of darkness, as is God and Santa Claus, in the sense that all things which humans imagine exists in the upper umbra and the dreaming. So it's possible the biblical God and the angels are like closely related to the Fae, or maybe, they are some sort of fae. And the idea of it having been the one true God of Abraham only entered the story later. A legend the fae tell about Caine is that he was a hungry redcap who slew and ate his brother. In any case, because he developed the vampiric powers later, it is implied that he was in fact a mage at this time, which would not be possible if he had been a vampire, because vampires are severed from their magical avatars. Except, of course, perhaps Caine was mage and vampire at the same time by virtue of being alive. He would be the only vampire who did not die to attain his status. It's not mentioned anywhere that he did die, and thus he would be kind of the only truly immortal one. Another theory is that Caine was not, in fact, the first vampire at all. Lilith was, and she embraced him. It is certainly implied that she has the power of the blood bond, though he may still have been a mage before that. Wouldn't be the last time mages become vampires to attain everlasting life. Not the last time that happens. Maybe vampires of this time were different. Maybe they were alive and could walk in the sun, and Caine was especially cursed. Maybe all that's just a lie to make Caine seem like the first vampire. Maybe Adam was also a vampire, or maybe Abel. Perhaps Caine's murder of Abel was in fact diablerie, a vampire consuming another vampire's soul and obtaining their power. Which is a special kind of murder. That's like murder plus. That is curse territory. Maybe Lilith embraced him a second time into her own brood. There are certain types of vampires who do this, and they just happen to be demon-blooded and of unknown origin, that falls sort of outside of the narrative of Caine being the first vampire. Maybe God was the first vampire. People in vampire lore certainly believe these things. There are groups which hold Lilith to be the real first vampire. Cappadocius, who was distinguished among his cohort in that he was highly educated, certainly did believe he could and would one day diablerize God. Which all begs the question, given that Lilith attributed diablerie only to God, who was this God character? Was he the patriarch, the Caine of an earlier vampiric social order? Something that bears mentioning, I think, is the tale of the Bloody Man, which is the origin story the Garou have for Caine. The werewolves hold that early man was wild, and in fact bound to the cosmic force of the wild, which made the cosmic force of the Weaver jealous, because she claimed humanity for herself. She captured a wandering young man and spun him into her web of power and stasis, making it so he would never die. The worm was angered by this and decided to consume him, but couldn't. The Bloody Man cut his way out of the worm's stomach, covered in his blood, which is why vampires bear the stench of the worm, even though they are creatures of the Weaver. He was then given pretty much the same curses, except not by angels, but by the sun and the earth. The injuries he inflicted on the worm would eventually allow the Weaver to entrap and corrupt it, and that's how you get all the story of werewolf lore. This does paint vampires as a distinct offshoot of humanity, beings with which the Garou have nothing in common. Vampires, I mean, obviously the Garou are half human. But of course they would want to differentiate themselves from like the worm-tainted parasites, wouldn't they? All we really know is that all this happened very far in the distant past, prehistory, and after Caine left Lilith, he went back to wandering the land for an indeterminate but probably fairly long period of time. Until he decided to settle down. It's lonely out there in the wilderness, honestly. The one time he had embraced offspring was two lovers, whose mutual adoration he wished to preserve for all eternity. However, when the lovers realized they could bear no children, they killed themselves by meeting the sun. Caine was kind of put off the idea of embracing by this. Even though he had seen many places and learned many things, Caine desired the company of home, so home is where he went, to find that the descendants of his younger brother Seth, who is probably not the vampire Set, but who knows, had settled a city named Ubar. With his immense power and the legends that accompanied him, Caine quickly became a prominent citizen of Ubar. He had great knowledge and expertise that he shared freely, and so one day, the wise king of Ubar, a man named Enoch, decided to meet and befriend him. Seeing the truth of how Caine was more god than man, he decided to abdicate the throne and give the crown to Caine instead. Out of gratitude and magnanimity, Caine succumbed to Enoch's pleas and embraced him. He also renamed Ubar to Enoch, which is a little confusing, but he did this to honor the wise king that chose him. Together, they ruled this great city of Enoch. But the great guy of Enoch soon felt the loneliness his sire had endured for eons, and desired a brother. So Caine embraced the mighty warrior Irad. Some say this was because Irad was a great warlord and Caine believed the city needed protection and the capacity to grow into an empire, while others say Irad was Enoch's brother, cousin, or son. He was certainly a powerful warrior and became the city's foremost military leader. One night, Caine met the woman Zillah, who was of a beauty so immense that he could barely comprehend it. Caine desired Zillah above all else, but she would not take him as a lover. She was a hunter, and she could see the beast behind his eyes. So Caine went to see an evil woman in the desert who knew how to do the blood bond, to gain access to her magics, and then betray her after she tried to entrap him in her own web of lies. Which, yeah, is kind of the same story as with Lilith, and this crone, as she is known, may well be Lilith. In this version, Caine embraced Lilith, and it's impossible to know which of them is true, really. If he is the first vampire, this must have happened this way. But there have been propagandists with reasons to espouse both stories. And frankly, it might not be Lilith. It might just be some other old lady. He might just be someone who makes bad choices over and over. The same ones. It's been known to happen. Nevertheless, Caine blood bonded Zillah and made her his wife, then eventually embraced her. These three, Enoch, Irad, and Zillah, are the known and named members of the second generation of vampires, though it is absolutely guaranteed that there were more than these three. The city of Enoch grew into the mightiest empire the world had ever seen, and Caine was a good and just god king, beloved by all. Vampires were not secret, but worshipped as deities. Mortals labored during the day and served as vessels for feeding at night. Criminals would be executed in blood feasts. Together they ruled the first city for countless generations. And every once in a while, one of the three would choose a worthy mortal and embrace them, thus creating the 13 antediluvians of the third generation, the forefathers of the modern kindred clan. Enoch valued wisdom and embraced intellectuals and administrators, people versed in art and philosophy, thus creating Malkav, Saulot, and Toreador. Irad valued prowess and embraced soldiers and warriors, tacticians, those who could prove their skill in battle, thus creating Bruja, Cappadocius, La Sombra, and Ventru. Zillah valued cunning and daring, the hunters that shared her profession. Sometimes rogues willing to do what was necessary, she was flexible that way, thus creating Gangrel, Hakim, Nosferatu, and Set. You may have noticed there's two missing here, and I think this is because this genealogy is utterly untrue and manufactured by the clans themselves long after the fact, to create a story that would fit their identity at the time. The idea that you inherited disciplines from your sire was very central to kindred society around the time the story emerged, and I think that is why it emerged. I am personally of the very firm opinion that the second generation, having no in-clan disciplines, were in fact technically equivalent to caitiff. A caitiff, of course, being a vampire whose blood had lost the identity of their clan and thus lacks attunement to any particular spread of three disciplines, while at the same time not being saddled with a clan curse. This was, of course, one of the worst things you could be in kindred society at a crucial point long after the story took place, but when it was told in this way. So the idea that the progenitors of the antediluvians were this needed to be stopped. I do still think there is value to the idea that the second generation favored certain traits, though, obviously, so based on that, I have developed my own genealogy. Bruja is great evidence of all this. It is known that Bruja, the antediluvian, was emotionless and level-headed, the opposite of what the clan is known for. He was a statesman, a scholar, an adjudicator. Thus, Enoch would have been the one to embrace him. Cappadocius also was a wise man, specifically a magus, with deep knowledge of medicine and the subject of death. An unmatched occultist. Thus, Enoch would probably have embraced him also. Gangrel, also known as Enoia, was not so much huntress as she was predator, venerated even before her embrace. Zilla makes the most sense for her, for she is not a city dweller, nor was she ever. There is actually a tale told among the Gangrel that she was the daughter, assumed biological, but perhaps also the child, that Adam had with Lilith, making her Caine's sister in any one of numerous ways. It is also noted in Gangrel oral tradition that Enoia was supposedly Caine's lover. Not mutually exclusive. Hakim was undoubtedly a warrior, and one of the greatest of all time. Though a foreigner, though it is not really ever said from where, it could have been anywhere that wasn't the Middle East, he was responsible for the security of the first city. I further believe that, given his truly unreasonable combat prowess, Hakim may well have been an awakened mage as well, of the martial artist variety, though perhaps more scholarly than tales let on. The Banu Hakim are, after all, famous for being sorcerers, and the other two clans, with some form of sorcery, both have creators who were mages. Irad is still the primary candidate though, like, no contest. La Sombra, well, by all means, he was just some guy. Perhaps a fisherman. Definitely a bit of a shit. Seriously, pretty much the only thing we know about him is that he was a misogynist. He only ever embraced one woman, and it was to make her into his mothering slave. His soul was remarkably dark. It already contained his shadow, so it's possible Zilla took pity on him, or Irad thought he could use him as like a soulless killer. Malkav was a seer in the truest sense, an oracle who could glance into other worlds, which made him quite mad. Enoch is definitely the guy for this, but it should be said that Zilla also valued mediums. Nosferatu, better known as Absimiliad, was a hunter. We know this, he was famous for it, he was arrogant for it, so definitely Zilla. Ravnos, Zapatasura, Drakian, or any of the other names that he has, was a trickster, a spy, which places him firmly with Zilla for me. However, there are those who say that he is actually not of the third generation at all, but a child of Caine who sacrificed himself so Caine could pass his curse of wandering onto him and settle in the first city. Another connection to Caine comes from Gangrel oral tradition yet again, where it is said that he was Enoia's twin brother, and the two were mortal enemies, which potentially also would make him Caine's brother. Saulot was a prophet, they say, but it's also said that Malkav gave him his prophetic powers after he became kindred. Mostly he seems to have been a moral philosopher of some sort, who may have been embraced by Enoch in an effort to temper the dark urges of the other vampires. He's very famous for being a good guy even to this day. Set was, by all accounts, a nobleman, a soldier, perhaps a knight of some sort from distant Egypt. He was also wise to the ways of mysticism. Make it kinda hard to tell, but just on gut instincts, I cut him to Arad. Toreador, also known as Ishtar or Arakel, was known for her skills as a sculptor. However, she was also very beautiful, and I suspect that Zilla embraced her in an attempt to free herself from Caine's affections somewhere down the line, but Caine clearly wasn't into, like, pretty women. Tzimisce was notable as a visionary philosopher of good. He was an experiment by either Enoch or Irad to put their own darkest impulses, their own beast, in another while embracing them, and be rid of them that way. Which is why Tzimisce is the most evil and least human of the antediluvians. I still hold Enoch for, like, the likelier candidate. Ventru was most likely an accomplished biological descendant of Enoch. a nobleman without peer and of great martial prowess. Enoch once again is the most likely candidate, but I do believe there is a strong case to be made here for a Ra. Now, it is pretty certain that these 13 were not the only kindred embraced in the third generation and in the first city. The first city may be more of a metaphor for a large empire where gods lived among mortals, and there were a number of generations of kindred present there. These 13 are just the only ones who survived. There is reference to a 14th surviving antediluvian, one who never sired a clan or couldn't, but that could be everyone and no one. Osiris, who may even have been Enoch, Malkav's sister Malachi, Lilith, even Abel. If you make it up, you can make it up. The list is long, is what I'm saying, and the answers it provides are nil. The thing about these 13 and how well they ruled and how terrible the ensuing events that followed were, really the whole story of Caine is that it glazes the fuck out of Caine. And of course it would do this. This is the story the Sabbat tells of Caine. The story where Caine is the good guy, and they are agents of righteous vengeance, fighting in his name. The Camarilla denies that any of this happened at all. No Caine, no antediluvians, no first city, nothing. The problem is they have no opposing story, which is why the Sabbat cares so much about this particular version of events. It paints the narrative of denial the Camarilla has been forced to adopt as the transparent lie that it is. It gives the Sabbat story of Caine the Righteous the entirety of the propaganda playing field. Just between you and me though, I don't buy it. I really do not buy it, in case that wasn't clear. I mean, he comes to this place where people know him. This is where he's from, right? They know of his mark and the evil it represents. Ostensibly, he is the devil incarnate, and then everyone loves him. And he is so selfless and wise, and the king gives him the throne. Greatest empire of all time is created this way. Caine ostensibly being a guy who was punished for a crime so unspeakable that we only learn it through metaphor, and we don't even know exactly what it was. Because it sure as shit wasn't just murder. Someone who is implied at every turn to be an absolute fucking snake of a person. And he was him? The Banu Hakim tell a different story of the first city. According to them, what happened was that a stranger came to the city of Enoch one night, dressed in rags. And while Hakim, as captain of the guard, had ordered all gates closed in the night, the guards let him in nonetheless, and he came to the palace where his grace and bearing immediately endeared him to all who met him. King Enoch made him one of his closest advisors rather quickly, and only Hakim was immune to his charm, seeing the evil behind his eyes. Caine was in the city for years, slowly taking over the palace, embracing the royal family to be his slaves. One day, Hakim and his most loyal lieutenants decided to rid the city of this plague, starting with the two parents of King Enoch, who had been embraced, in an effort to save Enoch himself, who remained mortal. In this story, Hakim, a mortal, fights several second-generation vampires at the same time, and wins. He then does the same with Caine, but Caine is so evil he manages to escape anyway, telling Hakim that though he foiled him here, he will go to other cities and do the same thing again. And because no one as badass as Hakim would exist in these cities, because obviously no such person could exist anywhere in the world, he would be successful there. Caine also destroyed the entire city at once, just like this, by stomping his feet a few times. So Hakim went back to the palace chambers of Enoch's parents, whom he had slain single-handed, drank their vitae and killed himself in order to become a vampire. He then took his followers into the mountains, created the fortress Alamut, and vowed to destroy all kindred. Now this all happens over the course of like a decade, and quite frankly, it glazes Hakim even more than the Sabbat story glazes Caine. But it does portray Caine as anything other than a perfect angel. Banu Hakim have a ton of stories of them being the most badass fucking warriors of all time. It's very normal for them. And the thing is, too, that the city of Enoch exists in the underworld, and was put there all at once. It was there in one block, implying it was destroyed all at once, which Caine does in this story. But of course, that happens later as well. Going back to the Beauclair book, we all know that there was a bit of rain. It's not unlikely that the first city actually also refers to the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah and all the other weird places that God flooded the world over, even though these do come from different stories and God did different things in them. The flood, or the deluge, is remarkably vague in vampire lore, even though it is clearly a momentous event. There are many different recountings on it, many of them unrelated to vampire myths, but what they all seem to agree on is this. The third generation were not loyal to their elders. At least most of them weren't. They craved the power of the ancients and saw themselves as slaves to their grander schemes, without any hope of ever ascending to the throne. So they started plotting the betrayal and downfall of the second generation. For reasons that were his own, Caine left the first city, perhaps he was in torpor. This is when the 13 chose to betray their creators. Incidentally, this was also when the flood happened. They're not related, they just happened at the same time, obliterating the first city in one fell swoop. I have some thoughts about this, namely that I don't believe it, and would like to propose an alternate theory, if that's okay. Clearly, more vampires existed in the first city than are recorded. Many more. This is basically canon. Caine's palace had quarters to host hundreds of them as guests. I absolutely believe in the rebellion, though. Not just because it's one of the central themes of Vampire the Masquerade, but the flood, or the deluge as we call it in vampire lore, was not, I believe, a literal flood, but a flood of blood, or rather vitae, which was later folded into that Abrahamic myth, because that's the way that we view the world. The antediluvians rebelled and killed, perhaps even diablerized the second generation. And I think they also did this with countless other ancient kindred. Their offspring, their offspring's offspring. I think they engineered this conspiracy to go out of their way to absorb the souls and power of as many kindred as possible. But it was a conspiracy of opportunity amidst an already ongoing bloodbath. In fact, I am of the firm opinion that many of them were not embraced by Enoch, Zillah, or Irad at all, and diablerized themselves to the top. They were of much higher generations. Probably not super high, but you know. When we think of history and prehistory, we see the number 2000, and we feel like this is evenly weighted. But it's not at all. There are almost 10,000 years of historical events before what we think of as the year zero. And then before that, you have prehistory. People were around! The first city, which again I hold to be more of an empire, allegedly persisted for thousands of years. There were some incredibly old vampires there, and the thing about ancient vampires with thick, powerful vitae is that eventually humans don't really do it for them anymore. They need to drink the blood of younger vampires to remain lucid. Or older vampires, but if they're the most oldest ones, that doesn't work. Maybe that's why the palace was so extensive. Maybe kindred were fed to Caine every single night. Maybe he's the god emperor. Maybe the antediluvians diablerized their grandsire himself. Though that doesn't seem to have stopped him from showing up later, which, to be fair, is not that uncommon with ancient vampires who are diablerized. They just show up again. It's also possible that the antediluvians started the true thickening of the vitae. Stories of mortals slaying prehistoric vampires are not just found in the tales of Hakim being a badass superhero. It's entirely possible that ancient vampires, even Caine himself, or perhaps vampires that came before him, were still formidable, but not nearly as powerful as the genuine godlike creatures that are the elders we know and fear today. They may have been more on the level of regular neonate kindred, which have been known to be defeated by skilled mortals. And this great feast on the young and some of the old may not even be the first time this happened. Maybe it was just the first time it went completely out of control. Or perhaps it was once again Caine's sin. If Caine was indeed in torpor, this war may have taken years. It's also possible that Caine was gone because he was protecting his offspring against a feeding frenzy by even older elders. Whatever it is that happened at the end, there were only 13 left standing. Fattened like leeches, powerful beyond belief, they began to rebuild the world in their image. They began embracing their own lineages. Though I think it's possible that some of the eldest Methuselah were already in the first city, and were spared diablerie as favored servants. When Caine returned and saw what the third generation had done, he clearly was not strong enough to defeat them, but he could curse them. And so he did. The curse would always be some ironic manifestation of their worst traits. Bruja, his soul dry as dust, would have his heart turned to ice, unable to feel emotion ever again. Cappadocius, his morbid fascination with death, an insult to the everlasting life he was given, was cursed with the appearance of a corpse. Gangrel, always more interested in being beast than human, was cursed to appear as the creatures she so clearly wished to be. Hakim, a little complicated actually, but in V5 compliant lore, his self-righteous lust to punish made him addicted to vampire vitae, to cleanse the transgression of vampiric existence. Okay, so the thing here is, in previous editions, different Banu Hakim had different weaknesses, and in many ways they worked differently to other clans, lending some credence to the story that Hakim did in fact embrace himself and was from the very beginning separate from like the brood of Caine. But that's also not necessary for the cased thing that happened with the Banu Hakim to emerge. All of those weaknesses were entirely in line with that same sentiment for hating vampires and needing to diablerize them. Also, and this is gonna be another tiny excursion, I've said in my original vampire video that part of their OG clan curse was that their skin would get darker with age. And while it's sort of a funny haha blackface thing, there's actually more to it than that, and I really feel like you should know about it. Obviously, they wouldn't look more African, their skin would like go black, not brown, because they were exposed to the sins of the vampires that they hunted. And something I learned rather recently is that the whole idea for this curse was pitched by Travis Williams, one of the few black creators working in RPG design in the early 90s, who looked at vampire and thought, where are all the black people? He thought it would be cool to have blacker skin represent greater power. And you know, that is cool. But back to our regularly scheduled program. La Sombra, who loved to move in the darkness and had forsaken all light, was cursed to have the light cast on every mirror to reflect his true monstrous self, or a lack of self, depending on what version of the clan bane you go with. So he would have to stick to the dark forever. Also, I guess modern technology like phones wouldn't work for him. Caden was like, he can't use the iPhone. Not that this would become a problem for a couple thousand years. I'm really not sure how else to explain the fact that this seems to be part of the La Sombra clan curse. Malkav, who had seen so much and said so little, who desired insight and understanding more than power, would have so much insight and understanding that he would be rendered powerless by it. Nosferatu, ever vain about his legendary beauty, and uniquely vile as a guy, like on the level of La Sombra even, would have his outside reflect the monster that he was on the inside. Ravnos, who burned the trust of all he surrounded himself with so often, he needed to constantly move around in social circles, would have to do so until the end of time. Saulot, with his ceaseless, annoying empathy for the cattle that are humans, would have to feed only from the willing or suffer their wounds. Set, that demon-worshipping prick who loved to bask in the glory of being descended of a sun god, would suffer the wrath of the sun sevenfold, and live in fear of lights even much smaller than that. Toreador, with her useless fixation on aesthetics, would be obsessed with it forever, transfixed with beauty, and almost as addicted to comfort as she was the blood. Tzimisce, truant to the whole event as he had fucked off to Transylvania years ago, would not be able to travel again without a whole lot of logistics involved, forever reminding him of the humanity he so desperately wished to leave behind. Ventrue, arrogant and picky to the end, feeling like he only ever deserved the very best, would remain unnourished by all blood that wasn't up to his refined palate. An interesting fact here is that the Ventrue back in the day always insisted that Ventrue the guy remained loyal to Caine to the end, though that is of course very much in line with the ethos of duty they preach in the Clan of Kings. Maybe he's so sensitive to betrayal because that is how he came about. Or maybe Caine punished him for failing to stop the uprising. Ventrue culture certainly includes a lot of opportunism. In terms of their magic, these are not individual curses, but one big one, clearly, always working with the same principle. Many bloodlines have their own curses, which tend to be variations of the clan curse in line with the founder of that bloodline. And when an antediluvian is usurped, the curse of the clan also changes to become more fitting. When Troile diablerized Bruja, the curse was almost inverted, filling the clan with the uncontrollable rage that had driven them. When Tremere diablerized Saulot, the curse became about his need for control, and the irony of being easier to control for it. When Augustus Giovanni diablerized Cappadocius, the curse became about how he is nothing but a parasite, and only knows how to take without ever giving anything in return, which is why the Giovanni bite is painful to its victims. It seems to apply to whoever is of the third generation, and there is a corroborating story from the Nosferatu legend about the ancient Methuselah Yima, who allegedly lived in the first city and may have been the son of Absimiliad or a biological grandchild of Caine. Yima and Caine were closer than anyone, and when the third generation prepared its betrayal, Yima fled the first city so that he would not be party to it. Instead, he looked for Caine to warn of what was happening. As a reward, Caine spared Yima from the curse, and he looks like a normal guy, and so do his descendants. Although there are not like many of them, and the main one claims that he was cured by drinking from the Holy Grail. And I mean, of course the Nosferatu would have stories about one of their clan who was spared from the clan curse. Of course they would. I don't know whether caitiffs are free of the curse because it's like not perfect, or because for some reason they are forgiven, but I would expect it is the former much more than the latter. Caitiffs bear the curse of Caine, but they do not bear the curse of Caine. The Deluge marks the beginning of one of the defining aspects of kindred life, the jihad, the eternal struggle between, well, everyone, really. Most people use the word to mean the struggle between very old vampires and the antediluvians, but there's a lot more to it than that. Depending on who you ask, it's the struggle of the antediluvians against Caine, the antediluvians against each other, young vampires against old in general. To some, it's the internal struggle with the beast. It's an ancient word, and it can mean many things depending on what kind of warmongering you're trying to justify. Though generally speaking, it refers to the great game of chess the elders are playing against each other over unbelievable timescales in some capacity. It's the conflict that guides vampire society in invisible ways. Most of the pawns caught in this struggle don't even know they're pawns at all. And with this, a little note on nomenclature, right? The Arabic word jihad, here of course with its idiosyncratic spelling, literally just means struggle. Though it is strongly associated with Islam, it doesn't really have a monopoly on it. In a Doylean sense, they also picked this word long before 9/11, right? Back when Al-Qaeda was still known as the brave Mujahideen fighters. I guess it was like a little bit of an in-between phase historically. In a Watsonian sense, kindred around the world probably use different words for it, as they did through time. Many of the clan names are sort of modern words or bastardizations thereof. I can guarantee you that the La Sombra antediluvian did not call himself by the Spanish term La Sombra in pre-Babylonian times. It's a moniker given to him and the clan after the fact, though it's quite possible maybe the phonetics of the names of the various clans influence the words and concepts that they are known by today. The Toreador are named as such because of their association with Ishtar, the ball dancer goddess. But the word Toreador didn't even exist before Georges Bizet invented it, because the Spanish word torero didn't fit well with his opera. Just made that up. The clans have different names in different places. These are just their overarching monikers, which not every one of them everywhere in the world would necessarily recognize. I do sometimes wish they came with different versions, as opposed to just like various epithets, because all the clans have a lot of different titles that are associated with them, but it would make things very confusing. It's also a universal rule in WoD that everyone pronounces the terms differently, and because vampire society spans so many times and peoples, there's no correct way of pronouncing anything, so long as people understand what you mean. You can say Camarilla, Camarilla, or even Camarilla. None of it is, strictly speaking, wrong, though some of it is a bit ridiculous, let's be honest. It's not entirely clear whether this happened before or after Caine's curse, but shortly after the Deluge, the antediluvians decided to shape a new society in their image. So they created the Second City. Allegedly, the investigation is still ongoing. The Second City was much like the first, just without a king. It lived gloriously for an amount of time and was built around the needs of kindred rulers, the same stuff really. And thus, again, I don't know if it really was a city, nor do I believe that it was, and I might even be willing to entertain the idea that it was the same place. They were, however, quite aware of the danger of a deluge happening again, only this time with them as the ones rebelled against and slain, so they limited their own offspring. Some sources say the fourth generation was not permitted to embrace at all. Other sources say new embraces required permission from the antediluvians. They certainly imposed very strict rules about it. Absimiliad, the Nosferatu antediluvian, who had been one of the leading forces in the slaying of the second generation, came to resent his hideousness more and more. He decided that perhaps he would be able to seek Caine's forgiveness if he slew all his childer and threw himself at the dead king's mercy. Two of these childer, Medusa and Baba Yaga, who again may or may not have already existed in the first city, fled from him. Baba Yaga settled in the northern plains, whereas Medusa went even beyond the great mountain ranges of the northwest and past the realms in which Tzimisce had taken up residence. And fun fact, Medusa's grandchild is the Phantom of the Opera. Just so you know. Now, of course, back then they didn't carry those names, and they had many names throughout history, and they may actually even be the same person. There's a notion that Absimiliad embraced them as incomparable beauties, which would have had to be before the curse, and then after the curse refused to blood bond them because he wanted their love for him to be for his real self. For their betrayal, Absimiliad created the Niktuku, a powerful bloodline whose only job it was to seek and destroy his offspring wherever they could find them. All modern Nosferatu descend from Medusa and Baba Yaga, and they all fear the Niktuku, who are proud beings in spite of everything, and will never spend the night underground. This is why the Nosferatu hide underneath cities and construct warren fortresses. It's not just their curse, it's tales of the Niktuku come to devour them whole. Of course, most modern Nosferatu know very little about this, and it's unclear whether the Niktuku are still around at all. Kindred historian Aristotle de Laurent dates this event at 6000 BC, which is noteworthy because it's pretty much the first time any of this is actually dated. Though who knows how accurate this is. It would place all the previous shit about the first city in a time when the first farmers were starting to replace hunter-gatherers by engaging in sessile lifestyles. There were cities in some locations back then, fairly impressive ones even, but really towns compared to what would exist in antiquity a few millennia later. There wasn't even no reading and writing at this stage. Nothing even close to the descriptions of Enoch, which is odd of course because Enoch does exist in the underworld. It is a real place there, and quite a glorious one at that, would have been possible to build back then. Some suggest that the story of Caine the farmer and Abel the hunter is about an ur-conflict between vampires who live among people and vampires who live in the wild. Though of course this interpretation is informed first and foremost by the Camarilla's interest in denying the existence of the antediluvians. Breaking that back down to the individual level, I see an interpretation where Caine's diablerie of Abel may have introduced the Ponzi scheme type vampirism of today, which we see gaining dominance in this period. This is in fact my favorite interpretation of the whole thing. You will hear more of it throughout this video, but this is what I believe is the truth, or the closest thing to it. Vampires were once hunters of humans, and Caine became a hunter of vampires, which allowed him to thicken his blood to become more powerful than any of them, but introducing the need to farm future generations to sustain himself on thicker blood. Obviously, the stain of diablerie in a vampire's aura is the mark of Caine. Lilith the Witch's ability to see the diablerie in Caine's aura certainly supports this, though it also implies pre-Cainite vampires generally had access to Auspex as a discipline, which also further cements the notion that they were caitiff. And this is the point in time when this changes. In the Second City, cold-hearted Bruhab developed a relationship with a young person of indeterminate gender named Troile. Troile was so deeply passionate that it made even Bruhab feel emotions, so he became addicted to their presence to feel human at all. Not even the embrace could temper Troile. In fact, it only inflamed them to seek revenge on Bruhab for taking away their emotions. So it's also possible that Bruhab allowed himself to be diablerized in order to be subsumed into an experience of emotion in death. This usurpation changed the Bruhab clan curse to that deep, lingering sense of anger. But allegedly, there are still descendants of the original Bruhab around who call themselves the true Bruhab, and who do, in fact, and I'm not kidding, have time travel powers. Some say Bruhab also killed Ventrue, but there is not much reason to believe this, aside from the fact that Ventrue is like the least seen or heard of from all the antediluvians. Nobody knows where he went or what he's been doing, and it's just as likely that he is dead as it is likely that he's taking a very active hand in the affairs of his clan. Personally, I reckon he's just not very present in the West and has made his home in India, and he's like stayed there for a couple thousand years. Which, India has been a Ventrue stronghold since the dawn of time. Though it's also possible that the story of him remaining loyal to the second generation was true, and he was killed or exiled by the other antediluvians for it. Maybe replaced with more ruthless successors. Wouldn't be out of character for his clan. The antediluvians were left fearful after these events and tightened their restrictions on what their descendants could do. This, however, made it so the blood could not spread across new generations at all, and not enough vessels with thick enough blood could feed the antediluvians themselves. They were starving themselves out of paranoia, and this eventually weakened them so much that they lost the ability to control the Second City and their descendants, leading to its collapse and the spreading of their brood all over the land. Personally, I think the implication here is that they all fell into torpor, probably quite violently at times, involving hunger frenzies that tore through hordes of mortals. And when they woke up again, the world was very different to how they left it. If you ask me, the events of the First and Second City happened over the span of, at the absolute most, 2,000 years in total, which is a lot of time, but I would not be surprised if it was significantly less than that. These are beings of thick, thick blood, and back then not even nearly as thick as they are now, and there just wasn't that many people back then to create like a steady vitae supply for the elders. It all goes up. It's like a huge network. It's only after the agricultural revolution and the subsequent population explosion that their pyramid scheme could really unfold. The first to leave the Second City was Set, allegedly because he was cast out for some unspeakable crime committed, attempted, or planned against an ally, lover, or relation of Malkav, possibly that mysterious sister Malachi. He returned to Egypt to take revenge on his brother Osiris, who had been ruling it all this time, somehow, thousands of years. He slew Osiris and ripped him into 1,000 pieces. Osiris was resurrected and became the king of the underworld. Horus took revenge on Set. It's all the standard Egyptian mythology stuff. If you want to learn more about it a little bit, I recommend looking at my video on Mummy the Resurrection, or picking up any of the books about Egyptian mythology. They make them, I hear. They're quite good. What matters here is that this is the schism from which Set and his brood never recover. Of the 13 clans, the followers of Set have always been the most isolated, and they as a group reject the story of the 13 antediluvians as equals. Although many of the stories they tell are of 12 disciples and childer of Set who betrayed him. They often speak of Ra as the one who cursed him and claim that he actually had very little power but was lying to everyone. And Set learned this truth by drinking the waters of death and eating the heart of the serpent Apep during his exile in the underworld. Somewhat suggesting that the first city may never have been in the real world at all, but perhaps some sort of ancient underworld necropolis from which kindred could come and go into the real world as they pleased, and then they sent Set not in where the door was, but deeper into it. Him being infected by that serpent is almost always the reason why he becomes a vampire. Some stories even claim that he was a vampire hunter in life. And I think it's not unreasonable to assume that they are casting Ra as like the ancestor of Set, not just in blood, but also in blood with a capital B, mixing up his familial lineage with his vampiric one. And frankly, who knows if he was the Egyptian mythology Set or not just some guy pretending to be him. Begging the question whether Caine is also Ra or Apep in these stories, or whether Apep is one of the second generation, or whether Apep is a different vampire altogether that was diablerized by Set. Maybe Apep is Lilith, who knows? I should also note that the idea of Set slaying his brother out of jealousy and them being cursed by vampirism by an elder patriarch might sound familiar to some of you. Maybe Set has stolen the story of Caine. The parallels are certainly common enough. One story suggests that Set was actually the one who learned the secret of diablerie, which Caine had been trying to keep secret, and taught it to his peers, kickstarting the event that led to the end of the first city. And then they self-righteously kicked him out, even though he told them how it works. The followers of Set have, over the years, mainly been antagonists to werewolves, because Apep is alleged to be an aspect of the worm. Being a world-devouring serpent certainly fits the bill. Most tales suggest that Set was corrupted so much by the serpent he slew that he became its devotee, and his offspring must join him in that worship, because only through the absolute experience and ultimate annihilation of the self can one gain true freedom. Others say that Set always struggled with the serpent, which he could not escape, and that he was not in fact its devotee, but some sort of prisoner. I don't know, this to me sounds a lot like what happens when you diablerize someone with a stronger will than you. They start making the rounds in your brain, and by all accounts, whoever Apep was a pretty dark fucking vampire. Maybe, just maybe, the vampire Set diablerized was Caine. Set himself has been in torpor for 2,000 years, and the last time he awoke, he gave a number of prophecies to his followers, though what exactly they mean and even what they are is a matter of a million schisms. Part of me likes the idea that Apep was actually La Sombra, but if that is so, then who was La Sombra? The fisherman made his home in the Mediterranean, by which I mean probably like the sea itself. And I believe the mysterious Aegean Sea peoples who were responsible for the Bronze Age collapse and who seem to have come out of the sea itself were his clan, raiding, overgrazing, if you will, because he was trying to get ahead of the other antediluvians. The only one who seems to have had no interest in endless bickering was Gangrel, who spread her brood across the world's wilderness and was never heard from again. I mean, also Salot went on a big journey and didn't really do that much. Someone who was making crazy progress was Tzimitzi, who had spent a long time wandering the land and diving deep into his experimentations of differentness and the reshaping of flesh. He ended up stuck in the Carpathians when the curse hit him, but he'd been there for a while, having encountered a city of demon worshippers that revered him, and eventually the head demon itself, a creature named Cupola. Garou and mages had sealed Cupola into the mountain, but with its help, to convene with it and to strengthen their connection, Tzimitzi turned the art of shaping the flesh into the art of shaping the land, and thus developed Koldunic sorcery, which is basically Avatar The Last Airbender type stuff. That's what that is. This, I'd say, the whole thing is a bit controversial. It's much more likely that he learned Koldunism from Cupola just straight up, instead of developing it himself, and then taught it to his descendants. Some say that he learned, actually, vicissitude from Cupola. Tzimisce the guy had an army of flesh-crafted ghouls, but he did not embrace lightly, establishing the well-known Tzimisce traditions of selective embraces and ghoul bloodlines. He didn't want to be an agent of Cupola, but he saw himself as its ally, the first true infernalist among the antediluvians. The following centuries is when he abandoned all pretense of humanity altogether, including any and all of the concept of gender, and simply began referring to himself as the Elder. We will return to him a few thousand years from now. Now, mercifully, comes a very long time skip. Which isn't to say that nothing important happened intermittently, it absolutely did, but it's all very poorly documented, and I'm trying to focus on things that are important in shaping the clans and sects as they are today. On one end of the spectrum, you have the Toreador thriving in the high-minded civilization of Greece. On the other end, you have the Gangrel, beginning to rule the dark Scandinavian knights as fleshly gods. All the other clans fall somewhere in between these two extremes, which is why our next stop is Carthage. But first, a word from me. If you love grand, world-spanning conspiracies of shadowy immortals, you should buy my novel. It's called Harm's Place. It has absolutely none of those things, but I wrote it. And people have been enjoying it. It is a sci-fi riverboat mystery set in a small town on a backwater planet in the distant future. Very character-focused, often cozy, but also exciting. You can get it only on Drive-Thru Fiction. I'm putting the link as the top thing in the description. I'm doing a very small syndication on account of not wanting to work with Amazon. And I gotta say, it's been doing pretty well there. Get it today. Get it tomorrow, and I would love, well, one of them is fine, you don't have to do both. I would love if you could let me know how you liked it, because I'm really hoping this won't be the last novel that I write. You may have heard of it in history class, the Carthaginian Empire. Based in what today is Tunisia, was a mighty state that easily rivaled Rome at the time, and had colonies all along the North African coast, as well as Iberia. Its heart, the city of Carthage itself, was ruled by the Bruja, and unlike the fearful and arrogant other clans, their goal was to establish a kindred realm like the glorious cities of old, except maybe not so archaic. Kindred and kind did not just coexist in this mighty realm, they worked together. Kindred sharing the power of the blood to make the wisest leaders and deadliest warriors into mighty ghouls. The very elephants Hannibal used to cross the Alps were in fact ghouls. The greatest scholars were embraced, so they could further their wisdom through the centuries and millennia, letting the city be guided by the great philosophers and intellectuals, as had brought glory to the Toreadors' ancient Greece, where the Bruja obviously were also very important. Except, of course, that they had tried ruling half submerged in the shadows and had suffered many fatal blows from the La Sombra. This was not just the brainchild of some Bruja Methuselah, but Troile the antediluvian themselves, who was more than happy to welcome the best and wisest of the other clans into the city. Many Banu Hakim, unhappy with their clan narrative of original sin, came to lend their skills in tempering the darker appetites of the beast by keeping the peace. And in fact, many of the ancient Toreador, primarily Mycenaeans, joined the glory of Carthage. But in Rome, the unholy alliance between jealous Ventru and mad Malkavians decided to direct its armies and fleets at Carthage mercilessly, for no reason other than spite. And after many protracted wars, they destroyed the glorious city and empire solely because they hated to see the Bruja winning, because they were right and the Ventru were wrong, those stupid wrong Ventru who lie and deceive and have never said anything that was correct about Carthage. As you can imagine, the Ventru do tell a story that's a bit different from that one. Rome at the time was home to the Eternal Senate. In the early days, before the Roman Republic even, the Ventru prince Collat found himself the ruler of an ever-expanding realm, attracting many mighty elders. To secure his power, he gave each clan a certain territorial claim, and invited them to join a legislative advisory body known as the Eternal Senate, to observe the politics of the Caine and ensure kindred were well cared for as Rome ascended to glory. The thing about the Eternal Senate was that it was structured in a way that only the stupidest and least influential elders could join it. All the cunning and influential ones were left out. In fact, they were the ones trying to get the stupid ones elected to make sure one of their more cunning rivals didn't get the power of that seat. Eventually, though, Collat's child Camilla, known to some as the greatest Ventru to ever walk the night, convinced his sire to advocate the throne of Rome to him, so that kindred may take an active hand in ruling the Caine, as opposed to just sort of sitting on the sidelines, which is what Collat had been doing. He had a vision for Rome being the greatest empire that ever was or would be. If only the Caine would be guided by their masters of the night. Collat accepted his child's wisdom and abdicated. Definitely didn't get killed or anything, and the reason no one has heard from him since is entirely because he's been in hiding out of the shame for not having had this great idea himself. Camilla reformed the Eternal Senate to give it more power, though somehow all the appointees ended up Camilla loyalists, and implemented a structure by which Ventru would rule over every other major city in Rome, advised by a chamber of the most prominent elders of the other clans residing in each of these cities, creating the first councils of primogeni. Now, I would like to note at this point that the name Camilla has no relation to the institution Camarilla, even though he was the guy who basically invented its archaic proto-structure. This was after the First Punic War, when reports reached the Eternal Senate that Carthage was a non-stop orgy of demon worship and sinister blood magic. Hundreds of Caine slain in the great temples every night. Troile non-stop fucking the demon-tainted infernalist vampire Moloch, one of the masters of the Bali bloodline. Now, the Bali are important in that they are a hellspawn bloodline that can embrace other clans into itself. Also, its origins are entirely unknown, though much speculation has been had over it. If you've been paying attention, remember when I talked about Lilith earlier, and how she may have been able to embrace kindred into her own clan. She just happens to be one of the major figures of that bloodline, and many Bali worship her as one of their creators. Carthage was a veritable tyranny of the night over terrified and enslaved mortals, and at the top was not even Troile, but just some random prince pretending that all this was somehow a problem and it had gotten out of hand, but, also unwilling or unable to do anything about it. It wasn't just returning soldiers. Malkavian seers, who, as a legacy of the old Eternal Senate, were the most prominent faction after the Ventru, warned of demons beyond the sea. Their voices were the loudest in their call to arms against the unholy empire across the Mediterranean. So the Ventru forged alliances with the Toreador and the Gangrel, even the much-despised La Sombra. They enlisted Assamite infiltrators and who knows what kinds of irregulars. This pact spent centuries at war with Carthage, for though the Bruja Empire was in decline because of its debauchery, the power of demonic blood ran strong with it. In the end, when the Romans razed the city, some Ventru generals remarked upon the fact that Carthage had effectively razed itself already, and all they had to do was incinerate the embers to ashes and salt the earth. It is said that Troile and Moloch sleep in each other's arms under Tunis to this night. Of course, this account isn't to be trusted in its entirety either. The Anarchs of modern nights are fond of telling stories of utopian Carthage, and the Camarilla, of course, needs to discredit them. Corroborating evidence suggests that the Venture retellings of the story are more correct than Bruja ones, but the Eternal Senate was itself not free of Bali influence. One of Camilla's earliest confidants, who deeply influenced his philosophy, was a Bali, and there were several prominent Bali figures who took up arms against Carthage alongside Rome, and in fact, even called for the war in the first place. There's no reason to think that Carthage wasn't once exactly what the Bruja describe, or certainly something close to it. When they talk about Carthage, and talk about Carthage the Bruja most certainly do, it is those ideals, not the demon blood orgy, that they aspire to emulate. This war and its alliance, organized not by the antediluvians but their descendants, as well as the system of the Eternal Senate, reinforced the idea that the clans would not always need to work in opposition to one another, but could also collaborate when it was to their benefit. Sure wasn't the first time this had happened, but it was a very notable one. Camilla continued to rule Rome, but when he eventually went into torpor and was presumed dead, the Eternal Senate lost much of its power, for lack of a stabilizing influence, though systems like it persisted for centuries. This marked the beginning of the fall of the Roman Empire, but it also allowed a new empire to rise, a new dream. 3 Methuselah decided that it was time for a dark phoenix to rise from the rot of Rome and the ashes of Carthage. The Toreador Bechter, a man of unmatched beauty and recent convert to Christianity, adopted the name Michael and led the charge. The Ventru Antonius, disgusted with the self-serving nature of the Roman kindred, decided to join him. The Tzimisce Dracon, interested in transforming the very world into a greater and more exalted shape, aligned himself with them as well. They decided upon Constantinople, the crossroad of empires, and it became perhaps the greatest kindred city of all time. The Triumvirate, as they were known, and their followers shared the dream, a vision of a legendary past in the first city. But it was to be more than that. Yes, kindred would be worshipped as gods, or in Michael's case, angels, and they would direct the politics of this realm. But they would do so at a moderate remove to protect themselves, and also so they could pursue higher orders of thinking than the banal battle with the beast. They would reason about their condition and seek enlightenment in various ways, as the Bruja philosophers of Greece had. It was a city of cults, religious and otherwise, that painted kindred as exalted creatures, established a sort of separateness from humanity, and that also eschewed the more violent sides of their existence. Many of the vampiric cults and religions, but especially Nodism, really found their feet in Constantinople. Michael was their spiritual leader, a religious icon, and in fact, to this day, that whole era is associated primarily with him. He did espouse ideals of humanity, but very deeply couched in the notion that vampires are angelic beings who should seek to understand humanity, not that kindred were innately human. He had a whole cult of beauty around himself that spawned a bloodline I actually go into in my old Bloodlines video. Antonius was the statesman, the administrator, the technocrat. He designed and implemented much of the bureaucracy of the empire, which was so complex we would today refer to it as, get this, Byzantine. Dracon was the thought leader, the philosopher-in-chief, being allegedly the only thing that Tzimisce Antediluvian ever loved, and imbued with the eldest's last vestiges of humanity when he was embraced. Consensually, might I add. He wanted all that intellectual exchange to make Constantinople into a city where Tzimisce, who were not utter monsters, could thrive and develop the arts of change, and thereby change the humans over which they rule. He was also a fucking dragon. He changed himself to look like a dragon, which, in fairness, he was embraced when he was a little boy, so I get it. Although even if that hadn't happened that way, I would get it. It's cool. Which actually brings us back to a situation I alluded to earlier, well into the glory of Constantinople, quite nearby, in the Carpathian Mountains. The Tzimisce had that whole area locked down, but their eldest, who was not necessarily their leader, had gotten in deep with demons, specifically Cupola. And the Salubri, who understood themselves to be wardens of morality to a certain extent, decided to kill him, because the Salubri don't like demon worship. The ancient Methuselah Samael, who may well have already been alive in the Second City, the greatest warrior that the Salubri had ever produced, counted among their ranks. He brought an army of Salubri and Assamites to bear on Tzimisce and its Bogatyr war ghouls, and destroyed the vile monster in single combat. Though not without being slain himself. I mean, this was a fucking antediluvian. But that wasn't the end of the eldest. It had planned for this possibility. Buried within Drakon, a fetus started to gestate. Drakon immediately knew what was going on, and retired to his lair for 9 months to birth like a Voldemort-esque vampire baby that he then gave to another Tzimisce Methuselah, Yorick, who would carry it into the world. And nobody knows where Tzimisce is tonight. It's underneath New York, by the way. It is under New York. It is a gargantuan engine of flesh, perhaps trying to devour the moon or the core of the earth or something like that. But that wasn't the only place where the Elder stirred. Everywhere in the blood of its offspring, in the discipline of vicissitude itself, were little specks of its ancient power. Now here we come to a little bit of a problem point, because there were a few major lore retcons over the years, but the story I will tell you is this. The Tzimisce of Transylvania, the old clan, the Draculesti, were perhaps somewhat more aligned with the philosophy of Drakon, but not by very much. They had come to distrust the eldest and vicissitude long ago, so while they still possessed shape-shifting powers, flesh crafting had fallen out of fashion with them a little bit. They could feel the demonic influence of Cupola through it. So while they flesh crafted everything else, they never did it to themselves. To this day, they consider themselves to be the only true remaining Tzimisce, because they deny that all the other Tzimisce, those who practice the tainted versions of vicissitude, are people. They think of them as just mind-controlled extensions of the Elder who are under the delusion that they have free will. I talk a little bit more about the old clan in my Cool Bloodlines video also, and I will mention them briefly later for reasons you may already suspect. Over a century later, time would catch up with Constantinople. It had been a good long run, but the cracks were beginning to show. Antonius was jealous that Michael had taken Drakon for a lover, not just for the classic reasons of the jilted and insecure heart, but out of fear for his power. This had always been a problem. From the beginning, he felt that he could never offer Michael the sort of free-spirited intellectualism that Drakon could, not understanding that Michael sought him out to ground himself as he bounced between lovers. He valued that just as much as what Drakon did for him. Antonius and Drakon's politics became ever more adversarial, and Drakon meddled more and more in Antonius's machinations. Toward the end, Antonius grew increasingly paranoid, and wished to implement a system quite similar to the modern Masquerade, which Drakon, interested in the transformation of and by humanity, was firmly against. But what made him go truly mad with depression was a personal slight. Michael had a habit of bringing his two lovers gifts in the form of young men, and occasionally women, of immense beauty and wonderful character. A boy Antonius had become particularly fond of was embraced by Drakon. The superego of Antonius became obsessed with control over the id Drakon, and Michael, the ego, was no longer able to mediate between them. But it was neither Michael nor Drakon who killed him, but his own offspring. They engineered a conspiracy to replace their effectively dysfunctional leader so that they could continue their political games. Soon after this, Drakon left Constantinople. He too had loved Antonius, and was resentful of the fact that something as human as a lover's quarrel had broken apart their eternal alliance. Now it was only Michael, and the decline of Constantinople began. Although it must be said that the decline lasted way longer than its glory, and Michael did a really good job keeping things together for another like 500 years. He wasn't diablerized until 1204. This is also where another character enters the stage that will become important later, almost a side figure at this point, Vikos, the child of the exact lover boy Antonius had been deprived of, was flesh-crafted to resemble Dracon after he left, and had their mind broken to believe that they were Dracon. They were then given to Michael as a gift, who found them a poor replacement for his lost love, but kept them in his harem for many years, breaking their mind further and further, making them the focal point of the lamentations and glories of the dream, shaping them into not the kind of person you'd want to be an ancient and powerful vampire. In the business, we call this subtle foreshadowing. Meanwhile, not too far elsewhere, the Archmage Tremere decided that he would have immortality. At the turn of the millennium, he was a mighty and well-respected Archmage, leader of his own house within the Order of Hermes, which you could kinda conceptualize as him having his own Harry Potter house, but there's like a whole bunch of them, there's not just 4, and like adults are in them too, not just students. Though he was mortal, he had a couple of centuries on him, but the world was changing around him, and because the magical consensus was changing, the spells he was using to prolong his life were beginning to fail. He ordered his most trusted apprentices to explore avenues to attain eternal life, and one of them, Goratrix, a vampire expert, suggested that there was a ritual capable of granting the powers of vampirism without the very big drawback of the destruction of one's avatar. For of course, without one's avatar, one cannot do magic. I'm talking real magic here, by the way. Magic with the CK, the type of power mages wield. If you want to find out more about those, I have a whole video on them. Tremere and his council chose to undergo this ritual of drinking a potion created by Goratrix. And then they all died and became vampires, and they didn't have their magic no more. It was gone. So there's like a few stories about this. The official line is that this didn't happen, and the Tremere actually do have magic that is the same as the magic of mages, which you can tell to vampires because they don't know about the magic of mages. But this is like clearly untrue, because we know this from like an out-of-universe perspective. The semi-official truth is that Goratrix fucked up because Goratrix is bad and incompetent, and Tremere in his infinite magnanimity allowed Goratrix to live because he had also drunk the potion and he was stuck with them. But there is a somewhat more likely story. The complex hermetic alchemy produced to craft this mighty potion, I believe, had 2 ingredients. The first was the blood of the Tzimisce elder Gorinich Miesiats, and the second was poison. Which, by the way, the Tremere stealing vampirism from the Tzimisce is something that Tzimisce still hate them for today. Because Goratrix didn't like Tremere. Goratrix hadn't liked Tremere for a number of decades, maybe even centuries. Because Tremere is an arrogant, authoritarian prick and a control freak. A guy so self-absorbed in his grandiosity that he couldn't even conceive of being betrayed by an apprentice he had regularly mistreated. Though they had no more magical powers, they still had access to vast quantities of magical lore, which can be a viable substitute. Also, vampire blood, very powerful. In very short, dynamic magic is spontaneous and based on the worldview of the user overpowering reality, whereas linear magic, also known as sorcery, takes advantage of specific paradigms of beliefs to use certain clearly defined spells. And the Order of Hermes, being pretty powerful, you know, there was a lot to draw from there. They also ended up stealing some magic from other vampire clans, like the Banu Hakim, and they could do this because they were still the greatest expert on true magic among all vampire kind, and honestly probably still are. Slowly, and secretly, while the other houses of Hermes were asking themselves, what is going on over at the Tremeres? What are they doing over there? What's happening? They embraced more and more members of the house, blood binding them to Tremere and his inner circle. They began using the blood as a powerful tool, creating the bloodline known as Gargoyles from Nosferatu, Gangrel, and Tzimisce, which is something that Tzimisce still hate them for today. Eventually, Tremere announced himself to the world of kindred and said, "Behold! I am the mighty Tremere. I have created my own clan, and I am just as powerful and worthy of worship as your antediluvians." And the few kindred who, cared, went, "Good for you. Also, you have no clan. You are, at best, a bloodline of the Tzimisce, and they have disavowed you. You may sit on this council, but we do not grant you the rank of clan. Also, you cannot sit on this council. Fuck off. You stole vampirism, you dickhead. We will kill you." So Tremere discovered that you can diablerize an antediluvian and thus become an antediluvian. So that's what he set out to do. And because even though he was just a little guy with limited influence, the learning and resources of his brood, which had access to knowledge no vampire could even imagine, not to mention his sheer will to power, made it happen. His victim? Saulot, the guy with the 3 eyes, the nice antediluvian, whom Tremere considered the weakest. Except just after his diablerie, which also changed the blood of his inner circle and offspring, Tremere suffered a psychic assault that locked him into his body. Saulot's consciousness had come with all that blood and power, and Tremere spent the next millennium in a battle of wills with Saulot within the halls of his own mind. He is occasionally lucid or interacts with his followers through visions, but he's not an active presence in the clan. How could a mortal with only a few centuries of life, though, withstand the might of such an ancient entity? Well, he was an archmage. Even average mages are basically made of willpower, and Tremere was one of the mightiest. Many say that Saulot actually manipulated Tremere into diablerizing him, though his reasons for this are unclear. Personally, I reckon it's because he figured Tremere was dedicated enough that he would end up diablerizing one of the antediluvians, so it might as well be him who would be opposed to his selfishness instead of someone who might vibe with that kind of thing. But as with so many things regarding the 3-eyed one, we will never know for certain. Clan Tremere, now under the leadership of Etrius, then proceeded to exterminate as many of the Salubri as they could, and they came pretty damn close to annihilating them completely. The other clans had to grudgingly accept the Tremere, but they were effectively universally hated. At least Troile had diablerized Bruja very early on. This was many thousands of years later, when the clan founders were mythological beings. And then they killed the most popular one among them? Mithras, who had known and liked Saulot, banned all Tremere from his domain forever. But their deep knowledge of magic meant that, unfortunately, pragmatism had to eventually give way to the universal boycott of Clan Tremere. During this same time frame, a similar but somewhat different story played out not so far away. For a long time now, in Venice, there had been a family called the Giovanni. They could trace their lineage straight back to the Roman Empire, where they had been known as the Jovians. And they could do this in part because they had deep knowledge and understanding of the art of necromancy. These were not stinky flesh stitches, mind you. They had command over the souls of the dead, with magical traditions reaching back to the ancestor worship practices of ancient Rome. The theory is that at some point someone in Rome had been an awakened mage in the same vein as Tremere, but of an entirely different faction, and obviously not nearly as powerful, but perhaps more influential. They would have laid the foundations for the procedural magic the Giovanni family would come to engage in for well over 1,000 years. All this time, they had spent collecting lore and knowledge of the ghostly arts, building a massive empire of trade and information. They were a vast family, dynamos of the economy, always with an edge because they could spy on, sabotage, torment their opponents, and learn of business opportunities far away simply by asking wraiths. Well, I mean, they didn't so much ask them as they forced them to do their bidding, but you get the idea. Over time, more and more clans grew interested in learning these secrets. Especially in northern Italy, they would do business with the Giovanni somewhat openly, even though they were mortals. Around the year 1000, old Augustus Giovanni, the family patriarch, decided he was not interested in dying and becoming some spectre future generations would consult for horse racing bets. So he began courting offers from various powerful clans. None were as enticing as the offer from Clan Cappadocian. The Cappadocians obviously were the clan of death and had the greatest knowledge of necromancy, but the type of necromancy they practiced concerned mostly the flesh. They had some knowledge of wraiths and what have you, even some had command over them to some extent, but the Giovanni were masters beyond compare. So when I say Clan Cappadocian was interested, I mean Cappadocius himself. Of all the antediluvians, he was perhaps the one most directly involved with the affairs of his clan at this stage, and he figured that his plans to diabolise God would require him to understand wraiths. If you want to understand wraiths, by the way, I did a whole video on Wraith the Oblivion. It's scary stuff. Maybe Cappadocius should have just watched that. So Augustus Giovanni was embraced by the antediluvian himself, against the advice of his eldest child, the Methuselah Japheth. Though Augustus then shared the secrets of necromancy with Cappadocius, he noted that due to the widespread nature of his family, he would need to cement his authority as patriarch by embracing more and more of them, starting with his son Claudius. Over the coming centuries, the Giovanni branch of Clan Cappadocian would be ascendant, leveraging their family wealth and influence to fast-track their way to immense power. Plagues, crusades, the death of the dream, and the return of various elders, including Camilla, by the way, as well as major geopolitical reshuffling in the mortal world, marked the period known as the War of Princes. This is a war in the same sense that the 100 Years' War was a war. It denotes countless conflicts between various clans and rulers of principalities spanning centuries. There's so much stuff in here, it could fill a whole game line. And it does! It's called Dark Ages Vampire, and it's a lot more than just the War of Princes. It's a whole game in and of itself. Some of the key battlefields were the frequent wars between the English Ventrue under Mithras, who had been the Eternal Senate appointee at Londinium, and now styled himself King of the British Isles, and the Scottish Toreador, which was a long-term conflict that you still feel today. A constant back and forth, often with the Toreador gaining ground with the Methuselah Helena was awake, in Mithras and Torpor, the Ventrue gaining ground when the situation was reversed, and a general stalemate when both were torpid or active. In Russia, roving clans of exiled Nordic gangrel went to war with newly arrived Tzimisce civilization builders looking to populate the sparse countryside with their degenerated revenant families. In Persia, a number of clans, but first and foremost the Banu Hakim, fell into disunity over younger generations following Islam instead of indulging in their bestial natures. In France, the Toreador, who had been not nominally but factually in control of everything for centuries, started squabbling with one another when an opportunity arose to fill the power vacuum left by the death of a deeply unpopular Ventrue king. In Germany, or the Holy Roman Empire, I suppose, the Ventrue Civil War saw the powerful elder Hardestadt pitted against his clanmate Julia Antasia, which also reflected a deeper conflict between ways of thinking during this time. There had been more intermingling of clans than ever for almost 2,000 years, and loyalties were complicated, not always first and foremost to the clan. Local princes and primogen of different clans could be stronger allies than princes of the same clan in some cities. Hardestadt, a senior kindred, but not yet the end-all be-all of the clan, stood for a return to tradition in this regard. Less inter-clan relations mediated through individuals, more loyalty to the concepts the clans represented. He won, and this will become ironic later. A lot of Ventrue wars going on really, but they were placed in charge of everything by the Eternal Senate, so of course they would be involved with all that. You can actually play the War of Princes in a grand strategy setting. There's a huge mod for Crusader Kings 3 called Princes of Darkness that models it, and I really like it. I've played it Well, not quite as much as the Elder Scrolls one, but a lot. Oh, I gotta say, I really like the Fae scenario that they have. I just wish there was a way to, like, have only Fae in them, like the way that there's only vampires in the... Because I really like Changelings. They kind of out... Changelings are my favorite game line in World of Darkness. I'm sorry to have to admit this in a video about vampire. Something that was happening en masse is that kindred, embedded in mortal institutions, especially religious institutions, started educating mortal hunters on the secrets of how to hunt vampires. And then, because they controlled those hunters, they could use them against their enemies. This led directly into the time known as the Anarch Revolt, which we will talk about in a minute. But first, we have to go back to the Giovanni. It's now a few centuries later, and Augustus Giovanni is Cappadocia's favored child, immensely influential in the kindred world due to his potent blood, family connections, and quite frankly, political shrewdness. However, the Cappadocian clan as such was a bit isolationist, seemingly disinterested in the politics of kindred. Elements within Clan Ventru wished to change this. They were of the opinion that it was Japheth who was keeping the clan back, being its de facto administrative leader, while Cappadocius spent most of his time with his studies or in torpor. They much preferred the cosmopolitan attitude of the Giovanni, and thus conspired with them to destroy Japheth and his most loyal agents, so that Augustus could cement his position as Cappadocia's #1 guy. They set off a complicated chain of events that would lead to the so-called Conspiracy of Isaac, which involved a number of kindred from various clans. Unbeknownst to the Ventru, Augustus Giovanni had set his sights on a much bigger target. They did kill Japheth. Claudius even diablerized him. But Augustus put on his Giovanni gloves and ended up diablerizing Cappadocius. The last thing he saw was the price tag on him. What followed was, of course, a purge, not nearly as successful as that of the Tremere, but also not as necessary, as many of the old Cappadocians retreated into the shadows almost voluntarily. And thus was created the Giovanni antediluvian. There are a few things to be said about Augustus Giovanni. He's the only guy we know for a fact that the antediluvian he diablerized is still around as a ghost, but he also may be the one where the diablery was most successful. The ghost thing is true, by the way, but it's secret lore, don't tell your players. I mean, there's rumors like this about all the antediluvians, right? Really every vampire who's ever died, but they're quite substantial when it comes to Cappadocius. And it is implied that this was his plan all along. Though as with all these ancient implacable beings that seemed so eternal, it's always easier to think that they could never be fooled. So there is much debate as to whether the diablerie actually failed or he just killed Cappadocius regular style. The clan curse was certainly transferred to him though, which may have other reasons, who knows. My point is really, many people like to talk about how Augustus is a weakling because he is so young compared to the other antediluvians. I do feel the need to remind these folks that even if the diablerie failed, right, that he is like a 1,000-year-old 4th generation vampire still. That's like the worst case scenario for him. Get off your throne. He's still one of the most powerful guys stalking the night out there. If indeed he still is, of course. The beginning of the Anarch Revolt is impossible to pinpoint precisely. Seriously, the official lore has placed it at several points, hundreds of years apart. Most likely, though, it blended with the dying down of the War of Princes, somewhere around the year 1400. In this time, cities and stretches of the country had rulers who often styled themselves princes, and sometimes swore fealty to greater rulers, one might refer to as kings. They implemented their particular systems of governments and controlled the population and to whom it was accessible in line with their particular needs. There were power-sharing arrangements here and there, certainly alliances. It was actually not so very different from our world today, except without internet or cell phones. Well, the Camarilla still does not use internet or cell phones, so pretty much exactly the same. Except there was a lot more clan loyalty than in previous centuries. The clans controlled everything. You were embraced into a clan, then you were that clan. That's it. It had a role somewhere within the clan, rules to follow, agendas to pursue, elders to obey unquestioningly. There was no possible identity for you outside the clan. No domain that didn't belong to the elders. You would be forever a wagee. God forbid if you didn't have like a clan of some sort. God forbid you'd be a caitiff. A cursed clanless devil, a sign of the end times, of the wrath of Caine, of Gehenna. Gehenna being the vampiric belief in the end of the world, and we'll get into it some more later. Right now, all you need to know is that everything is a portent of Gehenna when it suits the political powers that be, and that's pretty much it. The thing is, the blood doesn't just have like 13 neat genetic lineages. Sometimes the blood doesn't take the way it should, and instead of carrying the powers and afflictions of your sire's clan, you have different powers. Maybe even no clan curse. These are the caitiff in the truest sense of the word. The blood doesn't stay the same within the clans either though. This wasn't even a secret. Many powerful elder vampires spawned new bloodlines that had variant powers and traits to the main body of the clan, and they were considered part of the clan to give them political legitimacy. Except of course if this elder over here didn't like the elder that you descended from, their bloodline. In which case, congratulations, you are a caitiff too as well now. Mithras did this to a whole clan, we just went over it. You might be a perfectly full-blooded and obvious member of a particular clan even, but if you didn't know your sire, or if your sire had not made the proper introductions, or if your sire had chosen to reject you without killing you in the process, boom, caitiff. Caitiffs had no rights at all. They were actively hunted by all kindred, and the elders even made a sport out of it. The alternative was, of course, being like a tool used by a pyramid of elders leading all the way up to the antediluvian founder of your clan. Eventually you'd be a feeding vessel, though the elders tried to keep that quiet. After the Black Death swept through Europe, and peasants, by necessity of the value of their labor, gained new rights and freedoms, some of the neonates from that time began getting the idea in their heads that they, being in fact the same as those infinitely ancient and powerful creatures, not only maybe a little younger, might perhaps be more than cannon fodder in the endless conflict of the War of Princes. They began making their own decisions, transgressing against the schemes of the elders. The idea that vampires may in fact be something better than human, perhaps even destined to rule humans, spread like wildfire. Cue the beginning of the first Anarch Revolt. Many vampires stopped living in the shadows, and that really sent all those hunters trained by ancient kindred, but especially the Catholic Church, into overdrive. Cue the almost simultaneous beginning of the First Inquisition. Mortal hunters blessed with the powers of God and strength in numbers began descending upon the kindred. Those elders that controlled them and often shared quite a few secrets lost control of these institutions, and they were sometimes joined by mages, werewolves, even fae, though such things happened very much on the fringes of the Inquisition. Even the Banu Hakim showed up to kill vampires, though they usually targeted the elders, assassins casting the promised judgment. Really, whenever the vampires are getting killed, you will find the Banu Hakim somewhere in there. They didn't really work with the Inquisition at all, though. Vampire neonates, even those who stuck to the shadows, were easiest to root out. They were still connected to the mortal world. They knew people, people knew them. But the elders were far from safe either. Some of them even tried to use the opportunity to employ what little influence they had left to send these Inquisition death squads after ancient foes. The Sombra, who had finally won the battle with the Ventrue over control of the Catholic Church, saw much of their power base slip through their fingers like dark water. This was part of the reason why many elders retreated further into the night, letting the unruly neonates take the brunt of the Inquisition, essentially killing two birds with one stone. The Bruja Patricia of Bolingbroke, also known as Tyler, appealed to the elders to protect their offspring, who had served them so loyally, and give them the freedoms they asked for. Allow them to pursue their own paths. The elders of the other clans, led by Hardestadt, didn't agree. Instead, he proposed formalizing an agreement that would create the Masquerade, which was of course not a novel concept at this age. Also, he wanted all neonates enslaved. So Tyler declared war on him and all the elders, becoming the face of the Anarch Revolt, inciting young kindred to throw off the shackles of elder repression and take their power for themselves. And what a fire she lit. She actually managed to kill Hardestadt, which nobody knows about because he was replaced with the guy we out of universe call Hardestadt the Younger. Rumors of a lack of continuity really never took hold. In the world of darkness, he is simply Hardestadt. The power of the Ventrue seemed unbroken. But all over Europe, neonates started attacking their elders, taking their blood, their power, their riches, their land. In Sicily, Gratiano de Veronese, the youngest child of La Sombra, managed to sneak into his sire's lair and diablerize him, thanks to Anarch magics that allowed him to break his blood bond and Banu Hakim conspirators who wanted to see La Sombra dead. Again, just Banu Hakim. Instead of appointing himself the new head of the clan, he fractured it, deliberately, harnessing the long-standing discontent against their particularly cruel founder and a unique political situation where many elders suddenly found themselves having little influence. Drunk on power and a million new semi-religious ideologies, many of them originating in Constantinople, packs of vampires known as Sabbats began roaming the lands, drinking and pillaging and taking all they wanted. This made the Inquisition all the more fervent. Veteran hunters had learned much about how to kill kindred. Better funding came from church and nobility. More and more hunters not directly affiliated with the church joined the fray. Vampires were being embraced and dying by the thousands, which is like an unimaginable number today. Much less for that time, when there was like a fraction of the people. This state of affairs continued for decades, to the point where the kindred power structures were so destabilized that the Inquisition was winning. Many elders had been slain, diablerized, or hidden away at the ends of the earth for a few centuries in torpor. The power players of the time were either dead or had lost much of their base. Many young kindred roamed the land, not understanding what their existence was even about. The conflict between Anarchs and the established structure was long and tiresome, but didn't look like it was going to end anytime soon. A change was necessary, and it happened in October of 1493 in a small English town called Thorn. The coterie known as the Founders had been working on a potential new government framework for kindred society for a while. They had been important power brokers in their respective clans, but themselves only a few centuries old. Powerful, certainly elders, but not the true ancients of their clans. And I mean, hell, the whole clan Tremere was barely a few centuries old at this point. Nevertheless, representatives of all the relevant powers showed up. Clans Bruja, Gangrel, La Sombra, Malkavian, Nosferatu, Toreador, Tremere, Tzimitzi, and Ventrue were officially represented. There were individual Cappadocians present, but their clan was in the process of being usurped and eviscerated by the Giovanni at that stage, and was considered too unstable to really be a clan in political terms. Their legitimacy was still attached to the name Cappadocian, and especially the Malkavians were opposed to letting the Giovanni upstarts in immediately. The followers of Set weren't interested in abandoning the old ways at all, and besides, this was a European problem. The Ravnos were not really invited, let's be fair about that. And the Banu Hakim stayed away because they had joined the vampire war on the side of humans. Or, well, certainly on the side of against vampires. Though they were also getting decimated and actually had been forced to retreat from Europe and had a blood curse laid upon them that would make them unable to drink the blood of any clan but their own. Many Anarchs also showed up, though they didn't consider themselves representatives of any clan, but Anarchs first and foremost, which made it easy for the non-Anarch political elements within the clans to take up that mantle. The proceedings were long, but ultimately amounted to this. Amnesty would be granted to the participants of the Anarch Revolt, with the exceptions of some particularly egregious ones, who never would have shown up to Thorns in the first place. The society known as the Camarilla would move from an informal alliance to the official governing body for all kindred matters, paying allegiance to the institution itself above allegiance to clan or sire. Which is funny because one of the founders was in fact none other than Hardestadt, who for some reason that we don't know changed his mind completely on this very particular thing. Spiritually, the Camarilla would enforce holding the beast at bay by espousing an existence that was most like that of humanity, being not just dark and distant rulers, but embedded into the world of mortals, hiding in their walls. The power structure of the Camarilla would reflect a more modern feudal system, but with greater inter-clan integration. Much of the Camarilla's apparatus was modeled specifically after the baronies of Avalon and the court of Mithras, who was their king. He'd pretty much sort of won his war and was ruling over all of Britain, and if he had been interested, he could easily have controlled the entire Ventru clan on his own. Mithras welcomed this homage to him. He was, after all, in a way the host of the convention, but in the end, whenever they decided to structure something in a way that he didn't like, he would just ignore it, starting with the position of Prince as the highest authority. Within the new system, he was the Prince of London. In practice, he was still calling himself King of the Baronies of Avalon, and nobody would become Prince of a British city without his say-so. London absolutely became part of the Camarilla, but you better not call the Prince Prince. It was this drive for self-determination, even among the elders, and Mithras was far from the only one, that made it so the Camarilla would ultimately grant princes sovereignty over their affairs, so long as they enforced the 6 traditions. First tradition, the Masquerade. Thou shalt not reveal thy true nature to those not of the blood. Doing such shall renounce thy claims of blood. The most important one, the reason this whole mess had started in the first place. Humans should not know that vampires exist. It is, in fact, the most imperative rule that we fade back into the shadows and people never learn of our existence again. Second tradition, the domain. Thy domain is thine own concern. All others owe thee respect while in it. None may challenge thy word while in thy domain. An idea that appealed to many Anarchs, actually, to be able to conduct themselves as they saw fit. Of course, many already here saw that, in practice, the highest level of domain would always fall to the most powerful and most well-connected of elders. Third tradition, the progeny. Thou shalt only sire another with the permission of thine elder. If thou createst another without thine elder's leave, both thou and thy progeny shall be slain. At the time, everyone agreed that embraces had become rampant, and the situation would not improve if left unregulated. There were too many kindred and not enough kind, which created fierce food competition and, of course, made it hard to stay hidden. It's clear, however, that the power was to be placed back into the hands of the elders, effectively changing absolutely nothing about the way things were, except that the elders who would make this decision could now potentially be of clans other than your own. Fourth tradition, the accounting. Those thou create are thine own children. Until thy progeny shall be released, thou shalt command them in all things. Their sins are thine to endure. The selling point to the Anarchs here was, of course, the very concept that progeny could be released, and would be expected to be released, to be their own people. This was fairly rare before this. The idea that sires would have to be accountable for the actions of their childhood was also new. But of course, all this is couched in the same old bonds of loyalty and obedience, and in many ways, it made the rule of sire over child even more absolute. Fifth tradition, the hospitality. Honor one another's domain. When thou comest to a foreign city, thou shalt present thyself to the one who ruleth there. Without the word of acceptance, thou art nothing. This was made precisely to appease elders. Much like the concept of freely roving peasants, the concept of free movement for younger vampires without the direction of their elders was alarming to them. They worried that people would exploit this freedom, and so now everyone everywhere needs to inform the prince, sheriff, or primogen, depending on the domain, that they are there. Sixth tradition, the destruction. Thou art forbidden to destroy another of thy kind. The right of destruction belongeth only to thine elder. Only the eldest among thee shall call the Blood Hunt. The willy-nilly destruction of kindred by their elders had been like a major problem point with the Anarchs, though the idea that the life of all kindred was somehow special and exalted appealed to them. Of course, this is an extremely blatant way of saying you can no longer diablerize elders, but elders absolutely still get to drink you. So basically the Camarilla was sold as a compromise, where the elders would get everything they wanted and the Anarchs would get nothing they wanted. Aside from like superficial idea concessions that could easily result in an even worse way of unlife than before. The creation of the Camarilla was not a great change to address the ills of society. It was a bunch of middle-aged revolutionaries taking a moment of crisis to say, you know the status quo? We should keep doing that. They were already calling themselves the Camarilla before the conference even happened. It wasn't a peace offering, it was their way of saying, kitten, come back to toe the line and you won't be punished. And a lot of people didn't like that. Who would have thought? Because, you know, Michael's slave threw their penis at Hardestadt. Ultimately, 7 clans joined this new pact. The Brujah were of course terribly conflicted, having been the heart of the Anarch movement. But much of their cause had been about protecting the lives of young kindred, who were still dying in droves. And of course there was the idea of humanity, something the Brujah were quite fond of. The old dream of Carthage, vampires and humans living side by side, it was a powerful draw toward the Ivory Tower. The Gangrel were not a great and unified political movement in the first place. Though they too had mostly aligned with the Anarchs, there were not many meddlesome elders in their clan, but there were a lot of people who were loath to see promising young kindred slain. The Malkavians were drawn in by the whispers of authority in the back of their minds, and out of a desire for silence from the psychic pain of death and destruction reverberating through their telepathic network. They concluded that they needed structure in order to be useful, and besides, they had old loyalties to satisfy with the Ventru. The Nosferatu had a huge problem with their oldest elders, but their warrens were communal, and they already lived underneath the feet of humans adhering to their own masquerade. Being part of an alliance of clans might actually help them hide from their dreaded antediluvian and his Niktuku. The Toreador loved humanity and could not wait to be part of a respectable society made in their image. To be able to seamlessly blend into the mortal world and its rich artistry was a dream come true, and frankly, the way they had been striving to live anyway. The Tremere were a young clan, very centrally organized, bringing with it almost an ideal of authority that the other clans had grown too large for. Then as now, they were autocratic, as well as politically isolated. They needed an alliance with the other clans, and the other clans needed their magic. It was in fact the Tremere who put the blood curse on the Banu Hakim in order to forge this alliance. The Ventru, well, Camarilla was just going to be how they had done things for centuries anyway. Except now, all the other clans would have to play by Ventru rules also. All these clans had many dissenters, and they became what was known as the first anti-tribu, members of a clan who go against its sectarian allegiance or reject the concept of a clan altogether. But 2 clans were not happy at all. The La Sombra had nigh torn themselves apart. They had killed their antediluvian and were now expected to create a new tyranny to subject themselves to? Absolutely not. Some conservative La Sombra, of course, decided to go with the Camarilla, but the distrust with which their clan was viewed and the merciless killing of such anti-tribu by the main clan ensured that none ever achieved any real power. The Tzimitzi were, if nothing else, offended. They were supposed to emulate what? They'd always seen themselves as an elevated society apart from humans. They thought of humans as barely more than animals. Plus, their antediluvian was dead. They did not have that much in the way of hierarchy. They had gotten rid of some of their problematic elders as well. But really, those that remained had not expanded their influence into the rest of the world beyond the Carpathians in the first place. The human thing was the main reason they did not join the Camarilla, though. That was their big anti-selling point. Instead, the La Sombra and Tzimitzi reached out to all the craziest, most extreme groups among the Anarchs, the new cults and raider militias, those who had been maligned as Sabbats, to meet on the island of Majorca, join forces and become the Sabbat. Each of the major Camarilla clans also had many detractors join. Among the Brujah, all those who didn't care about Carthage that much, cared about Carthage too much, or cared about the wrong parts of Carthage, joined, as well as those whose entire purpose had become to destroy the Elders. Though more Brujah ended up Anarchs than Sabbat, of course, many Brujah anti-tribu consider Clan Brujah to be one of the founding clans of the Sabbat. Among the gangrel, many had no interest in joining the humanity-obsessed Camarilla, and had personal reasons to fight for freedom, pursue the hunt, or just seek glory with the Sabbat. Among the Malkavians, many were followers of the great Vasanta Sena, who had for a long time been an opponent of the practice of blood bonding, and refined the rituals of Voldery. Among the Nosferatu, many ironically somewhat elder members considered it cowardly of the main clan to not wage war against the Niktuku and their antediluvian master. Among the Toreador, there were a few outliers who were more obsessed with hedonism than art and humanity, often considering humans little more than materials for artistic creation. Among the Tremere, who else but our old pal Goratrix would betray the inner council in a final fuck you to his master, joining the Sabbat with a small number but massive power, and a lot of street cred for their clan having diablerized Salot. Among the Ventru, there were many who desired open rule of kindred over Caine, viewing their clanmates as old and weak, unable to accept that the world had changed and the aristocracy of shadows should remain in the shadows no more. Many in the Sabbat had their primary allegiance not with any clan, but with various cults, extremist groups, and hunting packs. There was, shall we say, a lot of diversity of thought in the Sabbat, by which I specifically mean the most fringe people of every conceivable creed. The only thing they all shared is that they were sworn enemies of the Camarilla and all it stood for. Well, except for the Masquerade, that shit seems pretty sensible, honestly. At least in practice. Nominally, the Sabbat still very much opposes the Masquerade. They just enforce it for purely tactical reasons. It'll be dropped the moment kindred rule openly over Caine. Promise. Pinky promise. The ritual of Voldery allowed Sabbat packs to break all blood bonds to the Elders and instead become mutually bonded to one another, feeling not the oppressive boot of command, but the love and camaraderie that the blood bond fosters. The fake love and camaraderie, certainly. It can strengthen a group of people that already trust each other, but when the pack is too internally divided, it can feel as alien as being forced to love a hated sire. Though they saw themselves as the truest of Anarchs, the Sabbat understood themselves to be a sort of religious military order above anything else. Many of the Anarchs were more honest adherents to the path of humanity than anyone, even the Camarilla. They desired not cruelty, but freedom, so they had no interest in a vampire supremacy organization. Ultimately, the narrative that worked for the Sabbat was one where Caine was the true god of vampire kind, and that the antediluvians had betrayed him. The Sabbat would be Caine's vengeance, the sword that kills the antediluvians and their minions, focusing first and foremost on the minions for now. This, of course, attracted exactly the kind of people who would be part of Sabbats in the first place. Disaffected Cainites who rejected the notion of humanity, driven by entirely different views on the beast. These paths were as old as vampire kind itself. The Sabbat didn't start out very strong, or frankly, as extreme as their reputation suggests. Make no mistake though, they were pretty extreme in the beginning too. For a few decades, perhaps even like a century or two, they spent their time collecting strays with ever more outlandish ideologies. The sword of Caine needed to be sharpened before it could really be used. From day one, there was enormous tension between the fundamental operational unit being actual murder hobos and various flavors of ego-driven cults, and the need for order and discipline. Not to mention the irony of a sect that rejects the concept of the clan himself being fully built around two clans who identify with being in the Sabbat. What emerged was an amalgam of the Tsimitsi's bizarre but suspicious tolerance of the weird idiosyncrasies of others, and the La Sombra's cell-like command structure that resembled both a navy and the Catholic Church, because those had been the two specialties of that clan. It also just so happened that after the Inquisition there were now many La Sombra who had been embedded in the church, but were now sort of floating without a job. In practice, the glue holding the Sabbat together has always been violence. So the Sabbat leadership the cardinals and their regent, needed to secure both spiritual authority and control the main military apparatus, which they did in the form of the Black Hand, a tribe of warrior monks emerging from a splinter group of the Banu Hakim that followed the teachings of a Methuselah called the Weeping Master. The Weeping Master had received a vision of the antediluvians betraying and slaughtering the second generation and destroying the perfect first city. He was overwhelmed by hatred for them, even, it is said, Hakim. It's possible that he received this vision in the first city before the betrayal. I think this is unlikely given that the timeline really wouldn't work out. The real main story is that he found a stone where blood was coming out of, and he licked it. He wished to avenge Caine, and so his descendants aligned themselves with the Sabbat and became essentially the sect's special forces, responsible for some of its most impressive victories, but mostly deployed against unruly elements within the Sabbat itself. Even though they never saw eye to eye with the theological aims of the Sabbat leadership, they became the sect's most influential religious grouping. Something very funny and also famous that happened in the middle of the Anarch Revolt, though unrelated to it, was, and this is true, Dracula. So Vlad the Impaler was a historical figure, and that is the historical figure he was in World of Darkness also. It's the same guy. It may surprise you to learn that he is in fact rather young. He adopted the moniker Draculesti from the old clan Semizi because he was aware as a mortal that they ruled over his kingdom from the shadows. He'd been given this information by the Ravnos elder Durgasin, who you might say orchestrated this whole situation. Even as a mortal, Dracula was such an accomplished general and warrior that he was able to defeat Semizi ghoul armies in battle and killed a number of younger vampires through strategy and cunning. The reason he wasn't just killed outright was because the Semizi took their sweet time deliberating whether he should maybe be embraced instead, given that he was, of course, the definition of a candidate, right? An utterly outstanding mortal. The problem was that he held real power in the world of Caine, and many of the old clan did not appreciate the implications of that. Eventually, at the point where he died in our history, he was turned into a ghoul and paraded around at court as a curiosity, but also deployed as a warrior. The special thing about Dracula that nobody knew was that he was, even as a mortal, immune to the blood bond. He was thus able to escape the influence of his master and become a free ghoul who hunted vampires for their blood. He did, however, wish to become a true kindred. Seeing the political developments with the nascent Sabbat and Camarilla, he made himself into a target for the Semizi elder Lambach Ruthven and his sire, the Methuselah Tabak, who had been leaders of a small Sabbat pact that may not even have been part of the official Sabbat. He tricked them into attacking his castle, but had already forewarned the Camarilla of their position, which descended upon them in force. As the two groups were fighting, he revealed a whole army hidden in the landscape, and attacked, forcing the Camarilla to flee and staking both Lambach Ruthven and Tabak. When Ruthven awoke from the stake in his heart being pulled out, he was presented with the ashes of his sire. Dracula then gave the Semizi a choice: embrace me and live, or meet the sun like Tabak had. Ruthven acquiesced. Dracula then promptly went into the dungeon where Tabak was still staked and diablerized him, gaining unspeakable power and devouring this ancient child of the Semizi antediluvian himself. He let Lambach Ruthven go. After all, he'd promised as much, and he let the matter rest. Dracula then basically became like a gentleman adventurer, though unfortunately he found it difficult to travel. He learned many powerful arts, driving the Anarchs out of Transylvania, establishing a Sabbat presence there. His own life is storied and obscure, perhaps more laden with speculation than any other kindred's, because, and you may have heard of this, in the Victorian age, he commissioned a certain gentleman named Bram Stoker to write a story about him and publish it. That was, of course, an insane breach of the Masquerade, which he may have done just for kicks, because, you know, he felt like he could. Nobody likes him, though. But you know what? Thus far, he's gotten away with it. He's gotten away with all his nonsense. Something we have all heard about is that in the year 1492, so just after the Anarch Revolt, the Columbus expedition discovered America. Now, there had been kindred in the Americas, clearly descended from Caine's blood, though certainly not part of the old clans and their particular traditions. And also more mysterious elements were and are still present. Especially among the Gangrel and La Sombra, but probably within all the clans, there would have been rumors of a distant land to the west. Many might have just assumed that it was India. It's pretty much canon that Cappadocius himself once spent time there during classical antiquity. How he did this is anyone's guess, but vampires have means. And who knows what voices were whispering to Queen Isabella when she funded Columbus's expedition. But by and large, the Americas were neither explored nor accessible to the kindred of the Old World. Of course, there also weren't that many kindred embedded in the native population in the first place. Due to flukes of geography and the fact that the only type of livestock amenable to domestication on the whole continent were fucking llamas, the population density was pretty low overall. They had to resort to domesticating hamsters. Yes, there were a number of glorious cities over the millennia. Cahokia, Cusco, Tikal, Tenochtitlan, but very few of them survived as major population centers for more than a few centuries. It wasn't an untenable situation, but many more kindred would have to live in the wilderness in some fashion sooner or later, with all the particular dangers that entails. Unfortunately, this part of the lore is not very well explored. Yeah, Gangrel would have thrived here, but given how common nomadic lifestyles were within indigenous people, like in general, especially like North America, the Ravnos probably would have as well. The plagues and genocides European colonizers brought over, of course, would have decimated their feeding grounds. Many would have failed to adapt. Not to mention that some plagues can kill kindred too, and the Westerners coming along to kill natives would often develop a thirst for genocide as well. After all, is it really diablerie if it's a kindred with no traceable lineage? Those pre-Columbian kindred that survived either integrated into the Western systems or remained irrelevant autarkists. Although I think a plot where some Methuselah wakes up in one of the many ruined and as yet unexplored jungle cities of Yucatan, when like the Mayan calendar cycled in 2012, and they go like, well, what the fuck is a Camarilla? That would have been very cool. That would have been a very cool plot. The discovery of the Americas profoundly changed the kindred world and cemented the power of the nascent sects. The first and most eager ones to go over there were the Sabbat, who saw the wide open country as free real estate, and were hoping to escape the clutches of their elders there. The more Western settlement continued, the more the Camarilla became interested beyond just the financial profit garnered from colonialism. Many young kindred were still unhappy with being under the thumb of the elders, and so they went to those elders and said, you know, I had this idea where I could, if maybe you want this, perhaps possibly go to the the new world and sort of expand like your influence there, you know, to sort of like act as your emissary and spread your influence to the new cities that are being founded and give you control over this new world. They were driven by the promise that in the Americas, someone who might be considered barely an ancilla and of diluted blood besides could be prince of a city that would soon rival the great capitals of Europe. To this day, the average American prince doesn't match the average European primogen in terms of blood, and yet they have utterly eclipsed them in terms of power and influence. Some bored elders, or those who had lost too much in the Anarch Revolt, decided to try their luck over there also. I reckon that, had it not been for the Americas, the Camarilla would have succumbed to internal tensions based simply on the fact that it didn't fix any of the problems that created the conditions for the Anarch Revolt in the first place. It was a sudden influx of resources that allowed conditions to improve and the system to continue. The Sabbat and Camarilla managed to stay out of each other's way for the most part. There were some wars, mostly the Sabbat with itself, playing out the classic Sabbat conflict of we want to be able to do what we want versus you gotta have a little discipline, folks, like just a tiny bit of it. But instead of talking about the Sabbat civil wars, I want to talk about the sect that really managed to come into its own in the Americas. The one which, if you think about it, is the oldest of the three, the Anarchs. The term Anarch was one imposed by Camarilla elders on all these various different kindred who rebelled against their authority. Their interests and desire for independence were considered politically valid by the Camarilla, which officially saw them as the wayward children of their legitimate government. They were not enemies, not even criminals, just people who were bad at doing the kindred life the right way. And this was lamentable. It was only in America that they began adopting the name Anarch for themselves, and went deep into experimenting with alternate structures of government. They were as diverse as the people who made them up, but they tended to involve some level of democracy or at least meritocracy, perhaps even Enlightenment thinking with regards to science and the kind. They were not anarchists in the modern sense. They did all have some structure of authority and control, and generally tended to recognize the value in, at the very least, the Masquerade. Those kindred who wanted to be left completely alone would come to no longer identify as Anarchs, but instead chose the label Autarchus for themselves, or they were labeled as such by outsiders. Anarchs would come to live on the fringes of the big cities, in communities that were left alone by the Camarilla so long as they didn't cause any trouble and occasionally paid their dues. They were, in a way, sovereign citizens. Now, the Camarilla would constantly manipulate their power dynamics, creating strong pressure toward power structure that resembled the Camarilla more than the purely democratic or truly anarchistic power structures that many Anarchs desired. The more Camarilla light the Anarchs were, the less the Camarilla would interfere with them. Additionally, being relegated to the borderlands meant they would always be the first to suffer from Sabbat incursions. These factors made it so that when what we consider anarchist theory rolled around, very few Anarch living arrangement actually looked particularly anarchist. While at the same time, the fact that it was hella dangerous to be an Anarch made it so young perspectives would always replenish the old. The great Anarch victory happened in the 1940s, when the Anarchs purged the Camarilla from Los Angeles, and eventually San Francisco, and then the other major Californian cities, in order to establish the Anarch Free State. Unsurprisingly, it was one of the more hierarchical modes of organization that managed to pull this off. But to most Anarchs, they were much better than the Camarilla, and they encouraged all kinds of Anarchs to show up to California and experiment. Anarchs also made great strides in parts of Europe at this time, which had been devastated by World War II. Berlin was split, allowing the Anarchs to come to rule the East, with the support of the Russian Bruja, who had taken the opportunity to strengthen the Anarch movement in the Soviet Union under their wing, to the point where most Soviet Union cities were in fact Anarch-controlled. Though the farther east you go, the less applicable these labels become. Certainly the Soviet Bruja were heavily influenced by modern anarchist text. They actually did try to rebuild Carthage, working side by side with humans to defeat tyrannical elders during the Communist Revolution. But alas, around the death of Lenin and with Stalin ascendant, many of these Anarchs realized that they had given the kind too much knowledge and power, and began using their supernatural abilities to terrify the councils and assemblies into doing their bidding, while disappearing into the dark bowels of the Soviet bureaucracy. Violence and paranoia became the tools with which these Anarchs protected themselves against perceived threats from kind they considered, in theory, equals. Just not quite as equal as they themselves were. Which in a sense is kind of what happened in the real Soviet Union as well. One of the first things that they did was abolishing the independent worker councils, the Soviets. All councils had to be run by the party. Otherwise, democracy would be used to topple democracy. And within the party, there wouldn't be that much democracy to protect democracy. Although in the world of darkness, the vampire Soviet Union ultimately fell when our old friend Baba Yaga awoke from torpor, turned the lights off, and slaughtered all the senior Soviet Anarchs. Mithras was hit in the face by a German plane bomb and needed to recuperate, leading to turmoil in London, during which the Anarchs firmly entrenched themselves not just at the fringes, but far into the center. Of course, the city never ceased to be a Camarilla domain. The truth of the matter was that the Camarilli simply didn't have the resources to care very much about what was happening on the other side of the world. So the Anarch Free State was able to develop pretty much in peace, spreading across the west coast. It did not ultimately fall to the Camarilla, but was destroyed by an altogether different type of vampire, the Quaijin, the kindred of the East. Now, the Quaijin will be getting their own video. They are deep and fascinating in their own right. A society as vast and complex as the Camarilla, Sabbat, Anarch trifecta. And though they are vampires, they work very differently to the Western kindred. Even the name Quaijin has an interesting connotation because it is ultimately just like a Chinese-Japanese compound word they had made up to give the American vampires in the Free State something to refer to them by. In Asia, no Quaijin refers to themselves as such, but instead use an array of names as vast as the languages and cultures of the world's biggest continent. There were a lot of cultures mushed together, and one of the internal points of conflicts was that they didn't want the name of any one of these cultures to be the official name of the kindred of the East in America. They'd already had a certain power base in the Americas, considering the West Coast part of their sphere of influence. They saw the Anarchs as weak, and besides, didn't really like their ideology or at times spotty respect for the Masquerade. In fact, much of the military command structure that came to define the Anarch Free State was put in place precisely to keep the Eastern kindred in check. They were the ones who destroyed the Anarch Free State, and when both sides of the conflict were licking their wounds, the Camarilla moved back in, installing Sebastian Lacroix as a rather short-lived and not particularly competent prince. Toward the end of his reign, the events of the original video game Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines take place. He ended up ousted in 2004, returning Los Angeles to the Anarchs, but in between these points, we can, and we must, speak of perhaps the most important period in kindred history. The summer of 1999. No, seriously, this is an important summer. They wrote like 13 books about it. The Camarilla-Sabbat War that happens in this time on the United States eastern seaboard is covered by the clan novels, of which there is one for each clan, and of which some are better than others. I personally love them because they cover a huge number of more or less connected plot lines in a chaotic and unnecessarily convoluted fashion. The many stories they tell are, in their totality, not good storytelling. Let's put it like that. However, all the weird coincidences, unsatisfying personal decisions, dead ends, non sequiturs, and big-lipped alligator moments are very realistic in the sense that this is the awkward way in which historical events actually play out. It's an unpopular opinion, but it is a preference of mine when it comes to large-scale narratives. I don't like it when they're neat and clean and have clear-cut protagonists. I want them to be a little bit bad and meandering. I'm a big fan of verisimilitude. That's why I like this hobby. They also have them as a trilogy, which I am 90% sure is those clan novels, but with the chapters in chronological order, perhaps with a few alterations to prevent spoilers. There's a reason why the Nosferatu clan novel is the last one you're supposed to read. Long story short, the Sabbat pools its resources and sharpens the sword of Caine to bring it down on Camarilla-controlled Atlanta in a surprise attack, mistakenly thinking that its Malkavian prince Hodge would be easy to take down. Yeah, they almost kind of fell from the get-go, but because of the sheer amount of personnel and materiel provided, they break the city after all. They then go on a well-executed campaign to capture everything from Atlanta to Washington, with the aim of driving the Camarilla from the East Coast entirely. This happens through a collaboration of the three Sabbat archbishops Polonia of New York, Borges of Miami, and Archbishop Vikos of eventually Atlanta. You know that Tzimisce from Constantinople and Thorns? They had been sent over by the Sabbat senior leadership in Europe to coordinate things. And this military campaign then is actually very successful. They conquer and conquer and conquer territory until that little slice of Lower Manhattan that the Camarilla had been holding onto under Sabbat rule was all that was left. At which point, the Camarilla Camarilla played their hand, having strategically retreated all this time in a war of attrition and taking the most valuable domain on the east coast, which the Sabbat had controlled for a very long time: New York City. This was a catastrophic blow for the Sabbat, and only one of several destabilizing events of this time. The Cardinal Luis Ambrosio Moncada, the mastermind of the Sabbat offensive, one of the scariest villains of all time, seriously, was killed in a sort of separate chain of events that was mildly related to the main plot. There had been a contract on his head with the Banu Hakim for centuries, but whenever they would send a guy to kill him, the guy wouldn't return. It was ultimately the elder Fatima and her very good friend, Lucita de Aragon, the vengeful child of the cardinal, who would kill him in the catacombs of a small church in Madrid he hadn't left for actual hundreds of years. He's reading intelligence reports on skyscrapers, not knowing what the fuck they even were. He was one of the true strategic geniuses of the Sabbat, an anchor for a lot of talent. Archbishop Polonia moved quickly to claim the cardinal title for himself, and the first thing he did was lose New York, as we have just learned, the domain that had formed the seat of his power. Just a few years later, Sabbat regent Melinda Galbraith was murdered, and her assistant, a neonate Tzimitzi, was so scared of being blamed for this that he has since just adopted her identity and is hoping that no one will find out. You know what? Honestly, given how quickly Sabbat regents die, I doubt he's still around. But this level of complete non-leadership was a huge problem at this crucial juncture. In Mexico, the treasonous Goratrix was destroyed alongside his whole ilk with one sudden powerful spell, probably effectuated by Tremé himself, if not maybe Saulo. This annihilated the Sabbat's access to magic. Also, there was another war going on, this one nowhere on Earth at all, but in the underworld. The Death Lords of the Stygian hierarchy, that's the western realm of the dead, specifically the bellicose Smiling Lord, was waging war against an organization called the Tal Me Ra. And the Tal Me Ra was a kindred organization with members of various other supernatural groups, primarily mages, wraiths, and one mummy, who had taken up residence in the first city. You know, from Caine days, the thing that was still in the underworld. Here they guarded 4 sarcophagi of immeasurable antiquity. They'd been interfering in kindred politics the whole time. Millennia. But their foothold was strongest within the Black Hand, the Sabbat Special Forces, where they established a secret organization within a secret organization called the True Black Hand, which was not in fact true to the cause of the Black Hand at all, but kind of the opposite. So it was the false Black Hand, but the real Black Hand was the false Black Hand. Because the Smiling Lord nuked, and I do mean nuked, the first city to smithereens, all that leadership in most of the true Black Hands, you know, the one that wasn't truly the Black Hands, most powerful figures were destroyed, taking away one of the Sabbat's most stabilizing influences, thus leading to a rapid decline, a de-evolution of the Sabbat in the past 2 decades. This isn't the first time it's basically collapsed under its own bluster. As an organization, it's always waxed and waned from the very beginning, whereas the Camarilla always remained rather stable, because they relied on humanity to keep them conceptually grounded. But wait! There's more! In Eastern India, vaguely as a consequence of the previous, there was another war going on still. This time it was kindred, primarily of Clan Ravnos, against the Kuei Jin. Now, what you need to understand is that the Hungry Dead are more powerful than kindred, especially young kindred, in terms of their personal individual power level. This is an oversimplification. They have different problems. Ancient kindred Methuselah still cook ancient and powerful Kuei Jin, who in turn are not limited by factors like generations, right? Every Kuei Jin can theoretically become the maximum amount of powerful. The main thing is that the Hungry Dead do not embrace people. They cannot make more of themselves. And they have no blood bond as an enforced loyalty measure. So naturally, when the Ravnos and their allies were waging war against the Hungry Dead, they relied on mass embraces. However, the Ravnos antediluvian was resting in that region, and the death of so many of its offspring made it stir from its sleep. The result was an absolute bloodbath. All Ravnos, all over the world, went completely bonkers omnicidal, especially toward members of their own clan, to the point where most of them were killed, and the clan is only now beginning to repopulate. The Ravnos antediluvian darkened the sky to do battle with 3 mighty Kuei-jin bodhisattvas for days and nights on end, until the whole debacle was finally ended by the technocratic union using big mirrors in space to laser him dead. Yeah, that's the thing in World of Darkness. I'm sorry if you were expecting this to be like thematic. I have a whole video actually covering the, for real, definitely, enlightened scientists, not mages, of the Technocratic Union. Although whether the Ravnos antediluvian was killed by this is very much up for debate. All the game materials seem to agree, but he is famously the most devious of his cohort. The events of the underworld in 1999, namely the 6th Great Maelstrom that created untold destruction in the Shadowlands, led to something never seen before. The formation of a new clan without the destruction of an old one. A reformation, if you will, of Clan Giovanni, formerly Clan Cappadocian, into Clan Hecata. Now, of course, the Giovanni had been going strong for a long time, but they never did manage to come close to destroying the Cappadocians. And though the Giovanni had been somewhat selective in their embraces, keeping them in the vast, sprawling family, there were always offshoots. Other families recruited into the fold, like the Duncern and the Putanescas. For unknown reasons, Augustus Giovanni was put out of commission, perhaps into torpor, as his blood must be quite thick. Though I think it's more likely that he fumbled his goal of sundering the shroud between the real world and the underworld so hard that he died. He may have also just been caught up in the maelstrom. I mean, I don't care how old a vampire you are, that thing will rip you apart. And through this, all the wraiths and specters he had bent to his will were released from his service, obliterating much of the family's service infrastructure. The incestuous empire of the Giovanni was struggling, and many remaining Cappadocians used this as a time to strike, to destroy the blood of the usurpers. Obviously, they weren't exactly in a position to do that either. There was also a deadline, 2028, when the Camarilla would, according to a stubborn rumor mind you, cease recognizing them as a clan based on a 500-year-old pact. And all the other descendants of the Clan of Death, all those little errant bloodlines of where Cappadocius had sown his red seed, were struggling too. Newly empowered hunters were slaughtering them and releasing many vengeful spirits into the world as a result. Not to mention the 6th Great Maelstrom couldn't have been good for their business either. It was a terrible time to be a necromancer. All the tides were turning and something needed to be done. And that something was the family reunion, a rejuvenation of the clan. You can call it the result of prolonged politicking, or you may call it just the beaten siblings coming home to find all the parents gone, but unwilling to return into the cold, dark world. Lost Cappadocians, Samedi, Gorgons, all kinds of minor bloodlines, even the Nagaraja, who are not technically even descended from Cappadocians, but powerful necromancers in their own right. They all showed up in Venice. Under the leadership of a mysterious elder called the Capuchin, they reformed the clan's leadership, and then took part in a ritual to join their blood back into one. What this ritual is or where it came from is entirely a mystery, but though their blood is now the blood of the Hecata, you can often still tell their origins by what powers their blood prefers. For instance, while the main clan has Auspex, Fortitude, and Oblivion, the former Giovanni, who also, let's be serious, still make up the majority of the clan, use Dominate instead of Auspex. Through this magic, corpses regenerated as their clan bane changed to that of the Giovanni's painful kiss. Though curiously, not all have that bane, and some instead now carry a sort of aura of decay that exposes everything around them to increased entropy, more in line with the original Cappadocian bane. There are many theories as to how these circumstances were engineered. The Capuchin seems to be the driving force, his identity an absolute mystery. Many think he's one of Cappadocia's original childer, Lazarus or Japheth, but of course Japheth was diablerized and Lazarus is his own story, but he may not be Cappadocian at all. Personally, it just strikes me as rather suspicious that Cappadocia spent all his life creating bloodlines upon bloodlines, all dedicated to different aspects of the study of death. And now they have suddenly all come together once more, thinking him long dead. It just makes you think, you know? The creation of the Hecata, just as the emergence of the Ravnos antediluvian, was seen as signs of Gehenna, the true end of the world, which vampires had been preparing for since time immemorial. It was the era in which the antediluvians would rise again to devour their spawn and do battle with Caine, only for Caine to ultimately still defeat them. There's a million, billion, quadrillion different predictions for Gehenna. This is just one of them. The thing they all have in common is the antediluvians returning in some fashion. There are many other portents, right? Like the emergence of Cainites with no clan, and later of ones with blood so diluted that they could walk in the sun, caitiff and thin bloods respectively. And then Gehenna happened, and the world ended. And that's why there's no more Vampire the Masquerade. No, seriously, it's all in the Time of Judgment sourcebooks. They describe what happens as each of the antediluvians rises. They describe it in detail. It has events and stats and characters, specific interactions that happen, what they say, what they do, their agendas. Look, Vampire the Masquerade stopped in 2005, and wouldn't you know it, there hasn't been a new release for Vampire the Masquerade since 2005. Except, of course, I'm lying. There absolutely has been. Look, around the year 2000, people loved apocalypse shit. They couldn't get enough of it. They loved it almost as much as they loved post-apocalypse shit around the year 2010. Now we're back to hating the apocalypse because we're in it. During the 90s, the creators of World of Darkness really just teased Gehenna more and more across every game line. Seriously, every type of supernatural had its own little apocalypse. The Maelstroms, the fucking Ascension Wars, the just apocalypse in Werewolf. It was just the apocalypse. And they kinda had to deliver something. So they delivered Time of Judgment. And then they just kept going. More editions came out, more splats, more ideas, characters, plots. Nothing, and I mean nothing, in the Time of Judgment books is canon, even though a lot of it is very cool. I very much encourage you to go look at it in your own time, but because it's not canon, I'm not going to cover it. In the official timeline, Ravnos was the only antediluvian to rise. But while Gehenna didn't happen, they didn't stop teasing it. More portents of Gehenna are coming every day, beginning with the Beckoning, an overwhelming urge affecting primarily older Cainites to go to the Middle East. Some resist for a time, but they all go eventually, and then they are never heard from again. Some of them are. They come back and they're very different people and they're encouraging everyone to also go to the Middle East. And they don't even all go to the Middle East. There's other places, and they just so happen to be places where it is suspected an antediluvian lies in torpor, or is otherwise just sort of there. Though I would fucking hope that they're in torpor. One of them waking up really is an apocalyptic event. But since Gehenna didn't happen, all that appears to be bullshit, of course. They don't exist after all. Or maybe they do. Right now, what is left of the Sabbat is heeding that very call of the antediluvians, content in their knowledge that now they will finally have the opportunity to find and destroy those treasonous bastards. The Camarilla is also going there to fight the Sabbat, although their official party line is that the antediluvians are still not real and the Sabbat is going after ancient and wise Methuselah in their deluded quest to slay these mythical monsters. The truth remains that countless kindred are heeding the beckoning and mobilizing massive resources to spill each other's blood. So I have to ask, what if Gehenna is happening right now? What if Gehenna has already happened? What if Gehenna has already happened over and over and over? Think of all you have learned today. All the chaos and conflict. All the apocalyptic orgies of violence that resulted in major paradigm shifts in the kindred world, which ultimately changed nothing. What if it's all just seasons of sowing, resting, and reaping? The clans embrace, build power, bicker and squabble, fattening up the vitae of their elders over centuries. I've only given you a small selection of the conflicts we know of. Carthage is fine. Then Troile shows up and it becomes a big funnel to put vitae in their mouth. What if the Anarch Revolt itself was a feeding frenzy for the antediluvians? So many thick-blooded elders disappeared, you can't tell me the Inquisition got them all. Do you really mean to convince me that it took us 10,000 years to reach the 15th generation? Anyone dedicated to doing that could do it in 15 nights. Isn't it at least a bit suspicious how incredibly rare very, very, very old vampires are? Even kindred over 1,000 years old are among the oldest of elders. But this is a species that's been around since before the dawn of civilization. And they only ever get stronger. So it's not going to be humans who take these elders down. They are, however, the only thing the oldest Methuselah and the antediluvians can sustain themselves on. How convenient that all branches of their errant offspring are going to them now, spilling each other's blood. Centuries of silence as kindred spread across the land. Sometimes the young consume the old, usually the old consume the young. And then, every few centuries, 1, 2, maybe 3 antediluvians wake up, slake their thirst, and go back to their business as genuinely godlike entities. No, seriously, they're in the world of darkness, almost nothing is as powerful as these guys. There is no reason to believe that such entities would even need to feed in the usual way. The Ravnos antediluvian made his descendants consume one another all over the planet. Are we sure all that vitae didn't go somewhere? The Quajan can do this. Most of their elders never drink blood, ever. They just absorb life force from around them. And though Kindred and Hungry Dead are not identical, they are clearly not completely separate species either. And that's where the dark truth lies at the bottom of our murky lake. The secret history of vampires is the pyramid scheme, the one that Caine began. This is the thing about pyramid schemes. The first few people recruited to them tend to do pretty well for themselves. Sometimes even better than the originator of the scheme. Being a vampire is not eternal life. It's an eternal struggle until you end up a snack for a dark god who has been pulling your strings all along. Only a few Methuselah are wise to this, and they tend to make themselves useful as much as possible so as to not end up on the menu. They too may be seen as winners of the pyramid scheme. The more the human population increases, the more winners there can be. But be careful. The blood of the third generation is only growing thicker, and they have moved past the need for moderation a long time ago. This is just one perspective on Vampire and Gehenna. I believe it, so do many other WoD veterans, and it does increasingly appear to be sort of the official canon truth. But I can't tell you that it's the truth, just as I can't guarantee that anything I have said today is the truth. That disclaimer wasn't for nothing, but the timeline keeps going. There's a second Anarch Revolt happening, and while I explain events from the year 2000 forward, I recommend that you maybe keep this grand scheme of things in mind. You might see patterns where you are most afraid to look. And just to let you know, as we move past the turn of the millennium, we gradually move deeper and deeper into the bailiwick of V5 lore, which in many ways acts as though Gehenna had happened in terms of having kindred live in the shadow of their shattered institutions. But it does this in order to return the game to like the dark and mysterious street level feel, where not everyone is involved in massive multiverse spanning plots. Since the mid-20th century, the Camarilla elders have been faced with an entirely novel problem that they had previously only encountered in the form of rumor or magical ritual. Except now, seemingly over day, all the Caine could do it. I'm talking about telecommunications and surveillance. The energy that human civilization had become able to harness with the advent of fossil fuels launched us forward technologically, just as it created the population explosion that those same Cainites very much appreciated. Even understanding nothing about it, it was immediately clear to them that this was a huge risk to the Masquerade. And though they made efforts to ensure CCTV and mobile phone cameras and even television didn't catch on, all that achieved was cutting them out of the immense wealth flowing about in the tech industry. They had seen the terrible and rapid developments in Caine weaponry, the leaps that guns and explosives had made in terms of power, precision, and accessibility, integrated with new psychological and tactical insights. Yes, Kindred still had the powers of the blood, but even the greatest mortal warriors of the past had no automatic breaching shotguns and rocket launchers. Whereas now every rank and file soldier and even ordinary people have access to arms that could kill an unlucky kindred. This, combined with mass surveillance and communication networks, was a nightmare greater than Gehenna itself. The Camarilla had banned using modern telecommunications. They did that early on. No kindred was to charge their phone. Eat hot chip and lie was all there was. They didn't even want anyone to have a computer, though they eventually focused on cell phones as the hated enemy, because computers obviously became like one of the key things of civilization, and it became permissible to have them in some limited fashion. But the cell phone thing was no use either. One by one, all the three-letter agencies of the world discovered that something was going on. And in spite of having Camarilla agents embedded deep within them, it was only a matter of time until they started talking to the dusty orders that held on to the ancient secrets of the time when Caine rose to slay kindred the last time around. And thus was born the Second Inquisition. Where the First Inquisition was built around church-sponsored armies and mobs led by powerful wielders of true faith, the Second Inquisition is the purview of domestic intelligence services and police-trained elite urban warfare squads. They don't call them vampires, creatures of sin. They call them blank bodies, some sort of parasitic human-like organism. The church still plays a major role, of course. The Society of St. Leopold was at first reluctant to lock shoulders with the FBI and the countless other police and intelligence services, but eventually they started providing intelligence and strategic support while they were training up their own troops again. Once again fueled with the magic of belief. Special shout out here to the police commando units of Brazil, who field by far the most experienced and battle-hardened strike teams the Second Inquisition has to offer. Because they've been at this since the 80s. It's just that they were doing it in Brazil, where most cities are controlled by the Sabbat, so the Camarilla never really cared that much. Not that they necessarily know precisely what was going on down there. Luckily for the kindred, it's not so easy learning information about them. Forget their incredible diversity of powers and curses. All the lies and misinformation they spread to control their own childer is even more effective against mortal hunters. Especially when those mortal hunters exist under a philosophical paradigm that doesn't allow them to believe in something as explicitly supernatural as vampires. You know the classic Annabelle sentiment of why isn't there like a book, a handbook that tells young kindred how all this stuff works? This is why. The Camarilla desperately does not want that shit falling into the hands of hunters. Shout out to Aristotle de Laurent's Encyclopedia Vampirica at this point. You know what you did. It is also quite fortuitous for the Camarilla that the intelligence services of the world are influenced by the extended technocratic apparatus, who, much like the Camarilla, really don't want anyone believing in vampires. And that may ultimately be their saving grace. Look, the Technocratic Union doesn't like that vampires exist. They don't like vampires at all. They would prefer if they were extinct. But they also understand that driving them to extinction by force is not a viable method of getting the job done. They simply cannot be driven to extinction. a fact which vexes the technocracy to no end. I mean, Jesus Christ, some of their ideological precursors were part of the original Inquisition. Ultimately, people not believing in vampires is much more important to the technocrats. You might say that it is by far their highest priority. And all this Second Inquisition shit is drawing a lot of attention to a suspiciously vampire-shaped blight on society. Sure, right now it's first and foremost institutional, but people who work in institutions are also people, and their opinions will be considered authoritative by other people who are not institutional. And then you have rumors spreading that the FBI knows about vampires. And then some slips to a politician on a congressional oversight committee looking to launch a presidential run. And they have contacts in the media who really want to see them succeed. It's an unfortunate development for the technocrats as much as it is for the Camarilla, and both have a vested interest in seeing the Second Inquisition strike first and foremost the Sabbat and the Anarchs, and then die down. So whether they are explicitly aware of each other or not, and I reckon Camarilla leadership and technocratic intelligence directors are probably in sporadic and very apprehensive contact, both will be using their considerable institutional influence and resources to cut the legs out from under the Inquisition. Because all these pro-level hunts, right, special forces strike teams and high-end gear, it's very expensive and always a little bit extra legal. For its own sake, the Second Inquisition must act as a secret organization within the institutions in which it operates. Its sponsors can perhaps suspect, but must never really know what all this money is for. Not to mention, like, all these agencies filled with people who have never picked up a book that wasn't like a gun magazine now have to dig through apocryphal academic literature on the occult, secret volumes and tomes of invariably false or outdated intelligence. Completely eschewing information technology really paid off when there was no vampire chat rooms or social media on the internet that could be scoured by feds to send commando units equipped with dragon-round shotguns into the havens of elders in the middle of the day. Yeah, so about that, not everyone agreed that the internet was innately a bad idea. In fact, especially the Nosferatu loved the concept of being able to communicate between their warrens without having to brave the night with couriers that might be picked off by the Niktuku. They'd been building international information networks for millennia, and they'd been embracing pioneers of information technology since the invention of the telegraph. So when the internet rolled around, a New York-based Nosferatu named Uncle Smelly began developing Schrecknet. At first, a secret tube within a tube of the regular inter-university internet, connecting with other Nosferatu with similar interests. Not unsympathetic to the Masquerade, of course, few clans are as constantly aware of it as the Nosferatu. They figured this might help them keep the Masquerade. The goal was to construct something unhackable, something that ran entirely on its own hidden infrastructure, its own code, operating system, architecture, everything. This was Schrecknet 2.0, the real Schrecknet, the vampire internet. Back then, it wouldn't even be weird. There were a bunch of experimental alternative internets around. Only the Nosferatu would have access, and they would keep it secret, because they knew the other clans would disapprove. But they got wind of it anyway, and during the Camarilla-Sabbat War forced the Nosferatu to allow them to use it for strategic purposes. And to its credit, it became a deciding factor with which the Camarilla was able to beat the Sabbat. But that opened the door to computer enthusiasts from other clans, even people of other sects using it. So unfortunately, it was only a matter of time before the NSA discovered and hacked Schrecknet. Even though it was shut down very quickly and the NSA at first didn't even know what to do with the information they found there, it eventually found its way to those secret compartments within the larger intelligence apparatus that understood these were not just some kids LARPing, but actual fucking vampires. One by one, cities all over the world started to get hit. First by small teams, then eventually by massive concerted efforts. London was the poster child for this. One of the first Chronicle sourcebooks for 5th edition was The Fall of London, at the end of which all vampires in London are killed. All of them. According to the official timeline, this was in 2012, and I don't really understand why they didn't go with 2011, when famously there were like huge public riots and destruction in London. I do this with my continuity. The express goal of the Second Inquisition is to create clean cities that are hermetically sealed against kindred. Drive them further and further into smaller areas so that they tear each other apart and the world at large becomes aware of them. The problem with this is that, of course, the kindred have forgotten more about hiding than the world's intelligence services have ever learned about finding. And isn't it easy to hide in a place the hunters assume is clean? They say London has fallen, but ultimately what happened there is an open question. You get to decide for yourself. It is, after all, your world of darkness. I ran a whole chronicle in London after the fall, and I will again, because London is kind of one of my blowbo cities, alongside New Orleans. Other clean cities that were scoured include Las Vegas, Bogota, Prague, and rather crucially, Vienna. Which is a problem for the Camarilla because Vienna was the headquarters of Clan Tremere, and the Prime Chantry was indeed the main target of the raid. The Tremere obviously having been the most centralized and hierarchical of the Camarilla clans. I mean, they called themselves the Pyramid for a reason. They still had every generation blood bonded to the generation above it, all the way up to the most powerful elders. And the Prime Chantry was not where they all resided, but certainly where they all worked. There were magical artifacts and phylacteries that forced compliance, hostages, secrets, libraries upon libraries of magic. All the whips of House Tremere were in that one place. And Tremere himself was there, though he was at this stage a big worm with 3 eyes, somewhat deep within the catacombs. Look, people change. And the Second Inquisition wiped it all out in a very costly operation that involved veteran strike teams from all over the world. This event was so metaphysically destructive to the clan that their clan bane changed to make them unable to blood bond other kindred, utterly destroying the means of control they had relied upon for 1,000 years. Now all Tremere were free to do as they chose, and some of the most powerful and ambitious bastards that had been their elders all over the world were now able to follow entirely their own agendas. This was perhaps the largest singular blow to the Camarilla at that point. The Tremere's magic was as essential to the sect's stability as the Ventru's money and the Toreador's cultural influence. With so many elders dead and so much pressure, the Camarilla knew that it needed to change drastically. So they held a conclave in Prague, notably in 2012, before Prague became a clean city. And there, many consequential decisions were made. Notably, this conclave was a particularly large one, where not just elders of the Camarilla attended, but senior figures in the Anarch movement were invited also. The Anarchs, of course, had been among the hardest hit by the Inquisition, almost as much as the ruins of the Sabbat. And they accused the Camarilla of utilizing the Second Inquisition for its territorial aims. Which, you know, I mean, who's to say that that's wrong? The whole premise of the conference was the Camarilla inviting the Anarchs over with the pretense that they wanted to actually talk about the Second Inquisition. The Camarilla instead decided that it was in fact the Anarchs and their liberal use of technology that had brought the Second Inquisition down on the kindred, and informed them that the kid gloves were about to come off. They themselves not at fault in any way, shape or form. There would be no more tolerance of autarky, no more independence, no more deviance from the blood. All the allowances for Anarchs as sovereign citizens of the Camarilla, which had been so graciously extended to them, would be retracted. You were either with the Camarilla or you would die. This had been a long time coming, of course, and not all the clans agreed on the proceedings. This is why, in a surprise feat of celerity, the Bruja Archon Theo Bell produced a dragon's breath round loaded shotgun and unloaded it into the open mouth of Hardestadt as he was speaking. Not even 1,000-year-old Ventru with 7 dots in fortitude can survive that unprepared. What followed was a brief but bloody massacre. Bell wasn't acting alone. He'd been one of the Camarilla's greatest warriors for a long time, a veteran of the Battle of New York, a key general of the Camarilla Sabbat War, and he'd had enough. The Anarchs attacked the Camarilla and killed many of their most influential leaders. In all its efforts, the Second Inquisition hadn't even come close to dealing this much damage to the heart of the kindred. Clans Bruja and Gangrel, founding members of the Ivory Tower, formally departed the Camarilla in favor of the Anarch movement, which up until this point had no actual clans attached to it, which, given what they believe, kinda makes sense. In the case of the Gangrel, they quit for the second time in the last few decades. In 1999, the Gangrel Justicarch Xavier, who had held the position for almost 300 years, quit the Camarilla, and many of his clan followed him. But given that the Gangrel are not particularly about centralized leadership, most actually remained in the Ivory Tower, often out of just political apathy. But sometimes also because of the Gangrel elder Karsh, the warlord of the Camarilla. Basically, their chief general for 5 centuries, a position created entirely for him and held by no one else since his death in 2003. Though, a funny thing about Karsh, there are very credible theories positing that he is in fact running around with 2 bodies, the other being Jelana Jav, who basically is the warlord of the Sabbat. And of course, this time around, once again, there were Brujah and Gangrel who stayed the course. But outside of those rather few, it was a declaration of war. For the first time since the Anarch Revolt, the Camarilla actively hunted and killed all those not explicitly dedicated to its ideals and institutions. The Anarch cities were actively invaded as the Ivory Tower brought its infinite resources to bear down on strongholds like Los Angeles. Many princes used this as a pretext to start going after everyone and everything they didn't like the moment they were able to launch themselves into full autocracy. It had become sort of unfashionable to hunt caitiffs and thin-bloods at this stage. Sure, killing them all would have been the politically correct thing to do. They were, after all, portents of Gehenna. But the Camarilla didn't really believe in Gehenna, and in spite of everything, it hadn't really happened. And then also, tolerance of minorities had become a thing that had influenced the culture in the Camarilla. But now it was all fair game again, and many cities conducted their own brutal purges of people who had often worked hard against much prejudice to get where they were. This, of course, ended up attracting even more scrutiny from the Second Inquisition. Not to worry though, the Camarilla certainly was diminished, but not everyone had lost interest. In fact, some unexpected new clans were very interested in joining. As unexpected as the vampire-hunting assassins of the Banu Hakim. Also in the summer of 1999, the Methuselah Urshulgi awoke from millennia of torpor in the depths of Alamut, discovering his clan in a sad state. You remember the blood curse that the Banu Hakim were put under when the Camarilla was created? Yeah, so their sorcerers, which are among the best in the kindred world, had spent every night since then finding a way to break it. Urshulgi woke up and then he just did that. He just did it. Then he called in some of the senior guys down at Alamut and asked, "Folks, I realize we've started embracing women while I was gone, and that's okay, you know, I'm literally a child. However, I've been hearing a lot of talk about this guy Mohammed, and though several of the younger members of the clan seem to bear his name, they all insist that they are not the Mohammed? And it's a bit strange to me, because I have been unable to meet this fabled warrior, who must be truly the greatest of our clan, for all the reverence he's getting." I'm kidding, he incinerated them, he just killed them immediately. Upon realizing that most of the clan had become devoted to a Caine religion over absolute devotion to Hakim, also including a bunch of Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, which is a particularly weird one for vampires, and even more exotic belief systems, he briefly considered just incinerating everyone and starting over, but luckily, restraint prevailed. He said, "Deconvert and return to Hakim, or I will incinerate all of you." No more Islam. It's illegal now. This created the schism, which ended up ripping the Banu Hakim apart, as much of the clan, especially those who had been operating first and foremost in the West, as well as some of the elders who were not necessarily Muslims themselves, but just had very little interest of serving under Urshulgi, petitioned for what were now effectively Banu Hakim anti-tribu, except they were most of the clan, to join the Camarilla. This also opened the door for the forging of bonds between the Camarilla and the Ashira, which is sort of the Camarilla of the Middle East, except devoted to Islam. Of course, there had been long-standing enmity between the Camarilla and the Banu Hakim for centuries, and especially the Tremere and the Banu Hakim could not stand each other. But the destruction of the Tremere Pyramid had made the Camarilla desperate to secure their access to blood magic. Besides, it wasn't like they hadn't done business before. The assassination of Archbishop Moncada was paid for by someone. Meanwhile, the followers of Set, after millennia of isolation, were making similar overtures, if you can believe it. The Camarilla certainly couldn't, but the Setites had changed over the millennia. They had spread across the world just as the Camarilla had, doing missionary work for their various denominations of dark unreligion, advocates for corruption as a spiritual virtue. In order to do this, they had always been pragmatic, adapting to local culture to bring them closer to the end goal of ultimate liberation. They didn't even call themselves the followers of Set anymore. They had become the Ministry, still a temple of Set, but less as a specific god, but an ideal that pervaded their every thought and action. A black guiding star on a white sky. Even though they didn't have very great respect for the Masquerade, they did trade in subtlety and had coexisted with the Camarilla for centuries. In fact, many princes found it useful to have a bit of a subversive element in town that could do all kinds of dirty work. Sure, the North African hardliners, who very much still were Set purists because they'd never left the confines of their little world and had to adapt, would be mad about it, but so were the elders of the Banu Hakim. Both clans held meetings with the Camarilla, and the final decision as to whether they would be allowed to join would be made at the same time. The Ministry, who had publicized their intentions, met with the Camarilla in a luxury hotel, probably in Warsaw, but that's purely speculation on my part on account that it was the only major UN event in 2013, and the V5 Camarilla book says it took place within the shadow of a United Nations conference. The Banu Hakim, who had been talking in secret, met the Camarilla in a single-family home in the small Danish city of Odense. The Ministry meeting ended in the deaths of several members of the Camarilla negotiating team. The Banu Hakim meeting went off without a hitch. It's not at all clear what happened, in the sense that obviously people in universe know, but it's not really in any of the books yet, as far as I have been able to discern at least. It could be that the old-school African Setites interfered, or Sabbat elements, or Anarch elements, given that that's where the clan mainly ended up going. Or they never had good intentions in the first place. Or the Banu Hakim themselves showed up to secure that they would be the ones selected, just in case the Camarilla was considering letting one clan join and not the other. The end result was the same. Banu Hakim in, Ministry out. And just as it was welcoming a new member of the family, there was another, even more unexpected knock on the door of the Ivory Tower. The La Sombra. Now, why would one of the founding clans of the Sabbat, a clan that, despises humans, the clan that prizes itself on having killed its own antediluvian, which had murdered Camarilla members by the thousands, which had waged war against the sect not 20 years earlier, suddenly wish to join? Well, it was really the work of one guy, Gian Galeazzo Visconti, the Sabbat Archbishop of Milan. He gathered all Sabbat in his city, as well as senior Sabbat figures from all over Italy and France, put him in his castle one night for a big blood orgy. Oh, it was the best festival. And then he set the castle on fire and declared that he was now the Prince of Milan and would run his city in the Camarilla way. Why did he do this? He's just a bit bored, innit? Just, bored. This is not a joke, by the way. Gian Galeazzo had been one of the most influential figures in the Sabbat's military operations for centuries. And he'd always been pretty much the strongest advocate for order and discipline. He was a ruler, not a plunderer. It's no accident that the Sabbat Code of Conduct was called the Code of Milan. Where only recently the Sabbat had been a force to be reckoned with, it had quickly devolved back into the base pit of violence and carnage that it had always been. Only a few exceptional bishops and cardinals were still able to keep their troops in line and mount effective operations. Gian Galeazzo saw that it was time to flee a sinking ship. But his main motivation truly was that he looked at the Camarilla and thought, These are the true rulers of the night. Even their lowliest members plan and execute webs of schemes that unfold over decades and centuries. They have the shield of decorum, rules that can be bent that people actually respect. Meanwhile, the Sabbat is just, if you are strong and violent, people follow you until someone more strong and violent comes along. To Giangaleazzo, the Camarilla simply seemed like much more fun. And many La Sombra agreed. There had always been more of them in the Camarilla than of the Tzimisce. They styled themselves the King of the Shadows, the Sabbat equivalent to the Ventru, organized with bottomless resources. But now they were fiefs of barbarian warrior tribes, relegated to the sidelines of the world, hunted by the Second Inquisition, no longer even a worthier opponent than the Anarchs. What was worse, the younger Sabbat now saw them as the elders to rebel against. It was a natural development, inevitable in hindsight. But they're not in yet. Their status remains somewhat tenuous. More and more La Sombra flock to the Camarilla, hoping to redeem themselves, selling out everything they know about the Sabbat, dealing it the final death blow. But the Camarilla is obviously hesitant to seem so desperate as to accept their greatest foe with open arms. At least openly. To be honest with you, the process has been so smooth and quick, it seems almost like a done deal. And in fact, many hold that, official recognition or no, the La Sombra are now, for better or worse, members of the Camarilla. We might see a La Sombra Justicar very soon. The final event in the timeline, at least the final major one, I will leave you with is the Second Conclave of Prague. The war between Anarchs and Camarilla was devastating. Not necessarily because the Anarchs were actually a powerful foe, though they have made some gains, but primarily because it was too loud, and the Second Inquisition was only fueled by it. They decided to call another conference to open peace talks, change the rules of the vampire world a little bit. Remind you of anything? I mean, aside from the before Conclave of Prague? Marcus, the Ventru prince of the city, envisioned himself as a new Hardestadt. He thought this truly would be the new Conference of Thorns, and perhaps even more important. He even chose a church as the venue to evoke that ancient and venerable atmosphere. It was a grand event, attended by senior Anarchs and important Camarilla emissaries. Yeah, remember how earlier I said that Prague is a clean city? Nowadays, that's the case? This is when that happened. The Second Inquisition had knowledge that this conference would take place and came in with shock and awe, incinerating the church's interior with the power of the sun. They had incendiary grenades, dragon's breath rounds, paladins with the powers of the angels, hallowed shotguns, flamethrowers, heavy MGs, armored vehicles, the most elite mortal commandos in existence, clad in composite armor developed precisely for this purpose. It was a miracle any of the kindred were able to flee at all. Following this, the Camarilla has become stricter than ever, while at the same time, the ascendancy of new elders has allowed for the rise of new ideas. Some are not as opposed to technology as they once were. Others seek answers in Nodist mysticism, a heresy that has been worming its way into the heart of the sect for centuries. Even others think it's time to stop the lies and have started speaking openly of the antediluvians, not as giants who will consume their offspring, but as great gods of shadow from which the power of your blood flows. This is the world the kindred live in now. The Second Inquisition, and now the Anarch Revolt, a world incompatible with the very concept of secrecy itself. I hope you didn't expect a satisfying end to this story, because all this was just the prologue. Your game is only just beginning. Play Vampire the Masquerade. Suffer the curse of Caine. Explore the ancient secrets. Fight for your life or the lives of others. A new night dusks. Consequences will never be the same. Oh, and if you think this video is over, think again. This is just the first part. In like 2, maybe 3 weeks, there'll be another one, just as big as this. And in it, I will be talking about the grand scale politics of the vampire world. the institutions that shape it, the various ways in which they organize, and how they fit into the global playing field of modern knights. I've been silent for a while, but I've been busy. Thank you very much for watching this video. Like, comment, subscribe, share this to your relevant communities. I know it took a while to make, especially because of the double feature thing. I was sick for a while as well. And I received great support for this from my Patreon patrons and all you folks leaving encouraging comments. But this is how long it takes. This sort of video, I mean, which involves an unbelievable amount of trudging through old and new source books, and it would not be possible without that support, so thank you. And in that spirit, see you very soon, my friend.